Tonight, you're not just watching a video, you're opening a door into the most decadent, forbidden corners of royal history. Picture a world where the bedroom holds as much power as the throne, where desire is inked beside treaties and battles, and where morality is just a velvet mask, often dropped behind heavy curtains. Welcome to the place where history whispers secrets it was never meant to share, where kings, queens, and popes don't always behave like the textbooks would have you believe. Before we begin, you know what to do. Find a cozy seat, hit like, subscribe, and if you're feeling bold, drop a comment, telling me where you're watching from. Every message you leave is like a flicker of firelight in the night, connecting us across time zones into a tribe of curious minds drawn to the darker side of history. Now dim the lights, pour yourself a drink, tea or wine, no judgment here, and get ready for a journey steeped in temptation, betrayal, and truths your history teacher definitely skipped. King John of England, the worst dinner guest in British history, let's be honest. When your nickname is Lackland, you probably weren't winning many popularity contests. But King John of England wasn't just unpopular. He was reviled, mocked, and hated so much that even the Magna Carta, a document that basically told him sit down and shut up, had to be written to stop him from acting like a royal gremlin in heat. But let's rewind. Imagine it's the late 1100s. England is recovering from the glory days of King Richard the Lionheart, a handsome warrior king off fighting crusades, inspiring songs, and posing dramatically in every cathedral mural. And then he dies. His brother John, short, moody, and shaped like an evil potato, slides onto the throne like someone who's just found the bathroom key to the apocalypse. John was the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, which already made him the medieval equivalent of the sibling who gets the leftover room in the attic. His nickname, Lackland, came from the fact that he had no titles or lands of his own, just a royal surname and a whole lot of jealousy. But when he finally got the crown in 1199, he didn't just misrule England, he practically rage-quit Europe. He managed to lose nearly all the Angevin territories in France, including Normandy. That's like inheriting a castle and somehow misplacing all the furniture, moat, and half the villagers. Why? Because John was petty, paranoid, and prone to starting wars with people he desperately should not have poked, like the French king and his own nobles. But John wasn't just a bad politician. Oh no, he was a walking HR violation. Court records and angry noble whispers show that he had a nasty habit of forcibly entertaining the daughters and wives of his vassals. We're talking about abduction, coercion, and violent misconduct that made him the #1 reason medieval noblemen stopped bringing their families to royal banquets. One baron literally left England with his whole household because John wouldn't stop visiting his castle uninvited. And by visiting, we mean breaking into the guest room like the worst kind of late-night Tinder swipe. But John's creep factor didn't stop there. He also had a penchant for torture, locking people in dungeons for funsies and starving opponents to death, including a 13-year-old nephew, Arthur of Brittany, who had a legitimate claim to the throne. That boy mysteriously disappeared while in John's custody. Medieval CSI was never called in. But let's just say, John was no magician, but people around him tended to vanish. And if all of that isn't enough, he also managed to get excommunicated by the Pope, which, in medieval terms, was the equivalent of being banned from both heaven and brunch. What did he do? Oh, just a little casual tyrant move. He refused to accept the Pope's choice for Archbishop of Canterbury. So Pope Innocent III clapped back by shutting down all churches in England. No weddings, no baptisms, no last rites, For 6 years, England was in spiritual lockdown, and all because John didn't want someone else to get promoted. When John finally caved, he literally handed England over to the Pope as a vassal state, then rented it back for an annual fee. That's right. He pawned his kingdom like a broke gambler at a cursed poker table. By now, his barons had had enough. So in 1215 they basically said, you either swear to this Magna Carta, which limits your power, or we're going to show you what a civil war looks like in chainmail. John agreed, then immediately broke his word, then sparked the First Barons' War, then got dysentery, then died. That's not even a punchline. The man who brought England to its knees and made Catholicism illegal for years died on the toilet from explosive diarrhea, after raiding a monastery's food stores and eating way too much spoiled peach cider and undercooked lampreys. His bowels surrendered before his army did. And when they buried him in Worcester Cathedral, historians say the monks didn't even sing the full prayers. Legend has it they just muttered, finally, and tossed him in like last night's regret. Legacy: he inspired the villain in Robin Hood. He got written out of ballads. And he's mostly remembered as the monarch whose biggest achievement, the Magna Carta, was literally a way to stop him from acting like a tyrannical clown with a crown. But hey, at least he taught the world something valuable. If you're going to lose half of France, oppress the church, abuse your barons, assault women, cause civil war, and die of diarrhea, maybe don't expect a good Yelp review. Charles VI of France. The king who thought he was made of glass in the rich tapestry of medieval royalty, where bloodlines were tangled, egos inflated, and sanity was always optional. Charles VI of France stood out not just for being mad, but for being artistically mad. While some kings declared war, Charles declared that he was made of glass. Let's set the stage. It's the late 14th century. France is exhausted, half-broken by the 100 Years' War. Plague has already done a few encores, the English are still annoying, and the French nobles are too busy stabbing each other to notice their kingdoms on fire. And then comes Charles, young, handsome, crowned at age 11, the light of France's future. And to be fair, he started out strong. Early on, Charles VI earned the nickname Charles the Beloved. He lowered taxes, listened to good advisors, and made a serious effort to heal the divided country his father left behind. For a while, he was kind of like France's golden retriever. Loyal, golden-haired, slightly overwhelmed but trying his best. But then, at age 24, while on a military expedition in the forest of Le Mans, something snapped. Literally, one of his knights accidentally dropped a lance, the metal clanging hard against the ground, and bam! Charles turned around and slaughtered 4 of his own men on the spot, screaming they were traitors. He only stopped when someone tackled him off his horse, and that was the beginning of the end. From there, Charles's mental state began shattering like stained glass in a tavern brawl. Some days, he refused to bathe for months. Other days, he didn't recognize his own wife or children. At one point, he forgot he was king entirely, and when someone brought it up, he got offended and yelled, "Do not insult me with such titles." But his most iconic breakdown, the one that made court scribes stare at their parchments like, "Wait, what did he just say?" Charles became convinced, deeply, viscerally convinced, that he was made of glass. Yes, glass. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. Glass, like wine goblet, cathedral window. Don't drop me fragile. He believed that if someone touched him, he would shatter into pieces, and he made royal tailors sew iron rods into his clothes to reinforce his fragile body. He refused to let people come near him. Guards had to walk on tiptoe, courtiers spoke in whispers, and heaven forbid someone sneeze near him. They were practically accused of attempted assassination. Now, to be clear, this wasn't a fun little eccentricity. This was a full-blown mental illness, likely a form of paranoid schizophrenia or what medieval doctors charmingly called melancholia with vapors of madness. And it hit at the worst possible time. Because guess who ruled while Charles was playing human chandelier? His wife Isabeau of Bavaria and his uncles, particularly Philip the Bold, all started grabbing at power like kids at a candy buffet. French politics descended into chaos, with factions forming, alliances crumbling, and literal sword fights breaking out in council meetings. The country wasn't just divided, it was being auctioned off piece by piece. And poor Charles? He spent his days pacing the halls, wrapped in stiffened robes, whimpering about cracks in his skin, while nobles signed treaties and waged proxy wars in his name. There's even one infamous story. During a feast, Charles suddenly stood up, stared at the candles, and began screaming that fire demons were crawling up his legs. He stripped off his clothes and ran, full speed, through the corridors of the palace, smashing into furniture and nearly knocking over the queen. The next day, he had no memory of it, but he did ask for thicker padding in his trousers, just in case. And somehow this went on for decades, yes, decades. France had a glass king for nearly 40 years, and during that time the Burgundians and the Armagnacs, two major noble factions, took turns using Charles like a royal sock puppet. They forged documents in his name, married off his children like pawns, and turned France into a chessboard soaked in blood. And did we mention the English invaded again? Yes. While France was busy arguing about whether the king needed a mirror or a window repair kit, Henry V of England marched right into Normandy, won the Battle of Agincourt, and casually started conquering northern France. Because, well, the king thought he was a drinking glass. Toward the end of his reign, Charles's condition grew even sadder. He would sit in dark rooms for days, clutching wax figurines, humming lullabies to no one. He forgot the names of his sons. He'd randomly burst into tears or laughter, sometimes both. When Joan of Arc rose to fame a few years later, Charles was long gone mentally. But had he been aware, maybe he'd have thought she was a glass angel sent to fix him. He died in 1422, half forgotten, half exploited, a tragic relic of what could have been a strong king. And when they buried him, there was no great mourning in the streets, no revolution, just an empty throne and a country in shambles. So what's the takeaway here? If your monarch starts wearing reinforced pants and whispering that he'll shatter if touched, maybe don't let him run the country for 4 decades. Charles VI wasn't a bad man. He was a broken man in a brutal system, someone whose mind betrayed him while power-hungry vultures pecked at his throne. He thought he was made of glass, but it was the kingdom that shattered. Pedro I of Castile, the man who loved, locked, and killed for passion. You know how in fairy tales, love conquers all? Yeah, well, Pedro I of Castile took that way too literally, with a sword in one hand and a heart in the other, usually someone else's. History remembers him as Pedro the Cruel or Pedro the Just, depending on whether you were the one getting kissed or decapitated. Let's dive in. Spain, 14th century. Castile was a bubbling stew of court drama, rival nobles, arranged marriages, and suspicious hunting accidents. Into this spicy mess was born Pedro, heir to the throne and future walking soap opera. His mom was Maria of Portugal, and his dad, Alfonso XI, was a king who loved his mistress more than his wife, which, as you can imagine, made family dinners super awkward. By the time Pedro took the throne in 1350, the boy was already cooked in resentment and seasoned with mommy issues. But hey, maybe he'd calm down once he fell in love, right? Enter Maria de Padilla, the one woman Pedro actually loved. He fell head over heels for her at age 17. She was witty, charming, and way smarter than anyone else at court, which of course meant everyone hated her. But politics doesn't care about love. His advisors were like, "Listen, Your Majesty, you can keep your girlfriend, but you have to marry a princess, preferably one with a castle and an army." So, under pressure, Pedro marries Blanche of Bourbon, a French noblewoman with an excellent bloodline and absolutely no chemistry with him. And guess what? He locks her in a castle 3 days after the wedding. Yup, 3 days. She was barely unpacked before she got upgraded to royal prisoner. Why? Because Pedro believed Blanche was secretly in love with someone else. Or maybe he just missed Maria. Or maybe he was just a man who made every emotional decision with a dagger and zero sleep. Now here's where things really go medieval. Pedro spends most of his reign ping-ponging between romantic obsession and rage-fueled revenge. He'd punish entire noble families just for insulting Maria. He'd pardon thieves but execute monks. One noble refused to kneel. Pedro made him kneel by having his knees broken. And yet, if you were loyal to him, he was weirdly fair. Merchants loved him. Townspeople admired his no-nonsense stance on corruption. He even improved coinage and strengthened the justice system. That's the twisted magic of Pedro, half tyrant, half reformer. Like if Batman were also the Joker. But let's talk about his real masterpiece of medieval drama. Drop of Blood, the death of Don Fadrique, aka Family Game Night from Hell. Pedro had a half-brother, Don Fadrique, master of the Order of Santiago. Fadrique was powerful, popular, and breathing. So naturally, Pedro got jealous. He invited Fadrique to the palace. All smiles, warm welcomes, wine and goblets, then had him stabbed to death right there in front of everyone. Legend says Pedro watched the whole thing with a cold grin, then turned to the guests and said, "Clean this up. The floor is slippery." Oh, but the real horror show was yet to come. The murder of Blanche, years after their disastrous marriage. She was still locked up, surviving on bread, water, and passive-aggressive letters to the Pope. Eventually, Pedro ordered 2 of his henchmen to strangle her in her cell. No trial, no scandal, just another checkmark in the king's burn book. And while all this was happening, his enemies, especially his other half-brother Henry of Trastamara, were gaining power. Henry painted Pedro as a monster to the French and even the Pope. Eventually, with the help of French troops and the infamous English mercenary the Black Prince, a full-scale civil war broke out. Pedro was pushed out, came back, then pushed out again. His reign was basically a medieval telenovela on fast-forward. Then, in 1369, it ended just as dramatically as it began. Pedro and Henry finally came face to face at the Battle of Montiel. But instead of a climactic sword duel on a rainy cliff, which, frankly, Pedro deserved, he was betrayed during truce negotiations. Henry stabbed him to death in his tent, yelling, "I am the king," which, to be fair, is one way to settle a succession crisis. So, Was Pedro a hero or a villain? If you were a commoner, maybe a bit of both. If you were a noble, probably terrified. If you were married to him, condolences. He loved passionately, ruled violently, and died in betrayal. A Shakespeare character before Shakespeare even existed. And no matter how brutal he was, you can't say the man lacked commitment, especially when it came to loving one woman and burning down anyone who got in the way. Moral of the story: don't marry for politics. Don't betray your crazy brother. And definitely don't underestimate a king whose love language is castle imprisonment. Charles II of England, the party king with 13 mistresses and a spaniel named after himself. If there were a reality show called Keeping Up with the Stuarts, Charles II would have been the breakout star, charming, scandalous, politically slippery, and somehow always surrounded by women, wine, and tiny dogs. Let's set the stage. The year is 1660. England is emerging from the joyless grayscale nightmare of Oliver Cromwell's Puritan regime, where music, dancing, and even Christmas were banned. That's right, no Christmas. People were so done with it that when Charles returned from exile, they basically shouted, "Please, Your Majesty, bring back color, ale, and sinful behavior. We're begging you." Charles, never one to disappoint, replied, "Say less." And thus began one of the wildest reigns in English history, known as the Restoration, because nothing says restoration like turning the palace into an open bar. Now, to be fair, Charles had had a rough start. He spent his youth on the run, dodging assassination attempts, disguising himself as a servant, and hiding in trees after his father, Charles I, was beheaded during the English Civil War. That trauma might have turned some kings into iron-fisted tyrants. Charles? It turned him into the king of vibes. The man loved life, and by life we mean pleasure, women, theater, wine, and not reading reports. Court documents often sat unopened while Charles hosted masquerade balls, watched plays, and made extremely poor decisions with very attractive people. Bed the mistresses. Let's talk about his royal hobbies. Charles had at least 13 publicly acknowledged mistresses, though unofficial estimates run much higher. These weren't quiet affairs. Oh no, these women were celebrities, trendsetters, and sometimes political chess pieces among the all-stars. Barbara Palmer, who was so influential she got a palace suite and a pension. Nell Gwynn, an actress beloved by the public. She once yelled, "I'm the Protestant whore," to calm an angry mob. Louise de Keroualle, a French Catholic spy/mistress who somehow got knighted. Charles wasn't shy about it either. He gave them lands, titles, and let their illegitimate children run wild around the palace like a royal version of daycare. Historians believe he fathered at least 14 children, all outside of wedlock. As for his actual wife, Catherine of Braganza, let's just say, she was endlessly patient, deeply Catholic, and basically endured a lifetime of "it's not what it looks like" while sipping imported tea through gritted teeth. Dog face the dog now. Let's talk about that dog. Charles was so obsessed with King Charles Spaniels, yes, that's really what they're called, that they followed him everywhere, even into Parliament, where nobody dared object because, he was the king. Rumor has it he even refused to pass laws that banned dogs from churches just so his could attend mass. The breed became a literal royal brand, dainty, loyal, slightly ridiculous, just like their namesake. Performing arts, the politics, aka Charles does the bare minimum. Now, was Charles a political mastermind? Not really. Was he a survivor? Absolutely. He knew how to read a room, say just enough to keep his enemies at bay, and then quietly retreat to bed with a barmaid. He balanced Parliament like a man juggling wine glasses, never letting them fully trust him but never pushing them hard enough to rebel. He signed deals with the French behind closed doors. He played Catholic and Protestant off each other while avoiding full commitment to either, the ultimate religious ghoster, and through it all he stayed alive, kept the crown, and never got beheaded like dear old dad. That alone makes him a miracle of monarchy. Skull the death, because even party kings die. In 1685, Charles suddenly collapsed. His doctors, in classic 17th century style, bled him, purged him, boiled him, and basically played operation with no anesthesia. Nothing worked. His final words? Let not poor Nellie starve. Even dying, he was thinking about one of his mistresses. Say what you want, but the man had consistency. Clapperboard the legacy. Charles II didn't conquer new lands or revolutionize the monarchy, but he brought joy back to a country that had forgotten how to laugh. He built theaters, reopened taverns, patronized science, and restored royal flair after decades of Puritan gloom. He was scandalous, lazy, flirtatious, but never cruel. And when history looks back, it doesn't see a saint or a tyrant. It sees a man who made ruling look fun. Caligula. The emperor who made his horse a senator and his bed a battlefield. If history were a circus and emperors were acts, Caligula wouldn't just be the headline. He'd be the flaming, upside-down trapeze artist juggling knives while screaming at the lions and proposing to the tightrope walker midair, and then marrying the lion instead. Born Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, try fitting that on a Starbucks cup, he was nicknamed Caligula, meaning little boot, because as a child, he wore tiny soldier boots while tagging along with his father on campaigns. Cute, right? That adorable nickname would one day be whispered in fear across Rome, associated not with childhood charm, but pure, undiluted madness at first. Rome had hope. After years under the iron-fisted Tiberius, people were desperate for a change, and Caligula, young, charismatic, and the son of the beloved General Germanicus, looked like the perfect golden boy. When he became emperor in 37 AD, crowds cheered, sacrifices were made, and coins were minted with his glowing face. It was like a Disney coronation, if only the fairy tale didn't devolve into an NC-17 fever dream. For the first few months, things were great. He gave bonuses to the army, recalled exiles, even abolished certain taxes. People thought, wow, maybe the empire is fun again. But then, 6 months into his reign, Caligula got sick. Some say it was poisoning, others say epilepsy. Some think it was just the universe hitting the panic button. Whatever it was, when he recovered, something inside him had broken. Not cracked, not dented. Snapped, he came back a different man. Like someone who'd spent a little too long staring into the abyss and found it sexy. The man who had once been hailed as Rome's savior now declared himself a living god, demanded people address him as Jupiter on earth, and reportedly held full conversations with statues of deities, mocking them for their fashion sense. He began building temples to himself. At one point, he replaced the heads of statues of Jupiter and other gods with his own. Zeus? Caligula? And then, of course, there was the horse. Caligula loved his horse Incitatus more than he loved most humans. The horse had a marble stable, an ivory manger, a purple robe, the color of emperors. Caligula once invited senators to dine with the horse, served it wine, and watched with glee as they tried to pretend this was normal. But he didn't stop there. Oh no. He allegedly planned to make Incitatus a consul, as in an actual Roman senator. Now, was this satire? Political theater? A test to see who'd fake clap the loudest? Probably. But still, imagine your local politician trying to pass a bill co-signed by a stallion. Then there were the bedroom scandals. Caligula didn't just blur boundaries, he dissolved them in wine and lit them on fire. He was rumored to have had affairs with all three of his sisters, holding public feasts where he'd parade them around like prizes, sometimes disappearing mid-banquet to return adjusting his toga with a smirk. He confiscated noblemen's wives, slept with them, then rated their performance at dinner. Like a twisted episode of Roman Love Island, he also turned the imperial palace into a brothel, not a euphemism, and reportedly forced senators' wives and daughters to participate. Proceeds? Straight to the treasury. The message was clear. You want taxes? Nah, let's pimp out politics instead. At public games, he'd randomly point at spectators and have them executed, just because he was bored. Or worse, he'd announce a gladiator match, then replace the trained fighters with crippled citizens or old men, just to see what happened. Spoiler, nothing good. And if you think he treated Rome badly, you should have seen how he treated the gods. He once marched his entire army to the shore of the English Channel, declared war on Neptune, yes, the sea god, and ordered the soldiers to stab the waves and collect seashells as spoils of war. Real campaign, real shells, real embarrassment. Be why the end of his short reign. Paranoia consumed him. He executed senators left and right. He forced people to watch the torture of their own families. He laughed during executions, sometimes offering critique like a talent show judge. He once boasted, "Let them hate me so long as they fear me." Well, they did. But eventually, they also got very tired. In 41 AD, after just 4 years, a group of senators and Praetorian guards, including those who had once worshipped him, cornered Caligula in a palace corridor. He tried to speak. They stabbed him 30 times. He died gasping, reportedly whispering something like, "I still live," before someone finished the job. His wife and daughter were murdered, too. Rome was done. So what do we make of Caligula? Some historians say he was mad from the start. Others argue he was warped by trauma, incestuous politics, and the sheer rot of unchecked power. Either way, he remains one of the wildest cautionary tales in human history. A man who confused power with invincibility and madness with majesty, that he wanted to be remembered forever. And in that, he succeeded. Rome never forgot the emperor who dated his sisters, promoted his horse-declared war on the ocean, turned the empire into a playground of blood, sex, and self-worship. Christian VII of Denmark. The king who masturbated during cabinet meetings. If you think kings are supposed to be regal, poised, and surrounded by decorum, Christian VII of Denmark would like a word, or more accurately, a long, unbroken string of awkward gestures, sudden outbursts, and extremely ill-timed self-pleasure. This is not your average monarch. This is the man who took too much information and made it government policy. Born in 1749 into the Danish royal family, Christian was groomed for the throne from birth, and by groomed, we mean technically educated while everyone pretended not to notice he was unraveling mentally by age 6. He had tics, hallucinations, panic attacks, and a general disinterest in reality, but no one dared say, "Maybe this child shouldn't run a country someday." Instead, they said, "He's sensitive," and carried on. By the time Christian became king at just 17, it was clear to everyone except the people in charge that this man was not equipped for high office, unless that office was padded and came with supervision. To his credit, Christian tried first, but any time he was required to be serious, he collapsed into laughter, tremors, or full-on tantrums. And during court ceremonies, he'd sometimes strip off parts of his clothing mid-procession, just to keep things fresh. His personal journal, What Little We Have, shows signs of paranoia, sexual obsession, and a complete inability to separate dreams from memory. And that brings us to the cabinet meetings, the sacred space where the fate of the nation is discussed, policies are shaped, and ministers sit in silence as their king, seated at the head of the table, begins masturbating. Yes, he did that repeatedly, openly, in front of government officials. Imagine trying to pitch a naval expansion plan while His Majesty is having a private moment with his royal scepter. Ministers were reportedly so disturbed that they began holding pre-meetings just to brace for the weirdness. Some tried coughing, some tried eye contact, one even tried praying. Nothing worked. Now, here's where things get weirdly political. While Christian was busy handling himself, a power vacuum formed. And into that vacuum stepped one of the most fascinating figures in European history, Johann Friedrich Struensee, a German physician who originally just wanted to treat the king's mental health, but ended up running the entire kingdom. Struensee realized something. If he could keep Christian calm, distracted, and occupied, often with masturbation breaks, he could govern Denmark by proxy. And govern he did. He implemented over 1,800 reforms in 2 years, abolishing torture, introducing press freedom, reorganizing hospitals, even suggesting education for women, a revolutionary idea at the time. Of course, all this modern progress came at a price. Struensee also began sleeping with Queen Caroline Matilda, Christian's English wife, who was very lonely, very intelligent, and very aware that her husband was about as emotionally available as a turnip. They became lovers, partners in reform, and basically Denmark's hottest political power couple, all while Christian babbled in the background, played with marionettes, or attempted to educate himself through erotic literature. For a brief moment, Denmark had the illusion of stability. The king was occupied, again in multiple senses, the queen was glowing, and the real adult in the room was ruling with a pen in one hand and Caroline's waist in the other. But, because this is royal history, the good times couldn't last. The Danish nobility, who hated Struensee's reforms and resented his influence, began whispering in the right ears. They painted him as a foreign usurper, a manipulative seducer, a heretic. Rumors exploded that he used dark magic, that Caroline was pregnant with his child, that he planned to depose Christian entirely. And then came the coup d'etat in the dead of night. Struensee and Caroline were arrested. Christian, reportedly confused, thought it was a surprise birthday party. When told his wife was being imprisoned for treason, he asked, "Which wife?" Struensee was tortured, publicly humiliated, and eventually beheaded. His body was dismembered and displayed, just in case anyone forgot how Denmark felt about uppity Germans who slept with queens and tried to end torture. As for Queen Caroline Matilda, she was exiled, ripped away from her children, and died in isolation at age 23. A footnote in a tragic royal soap opera she tried to rewrite. And Christian? He lived for 29 more years. He didn't rule, didn't parent, didn't really do much of anything. He wandered palace corridors, muttered to himself, played with invisible friends, and occasionally reminded courtiers why the term Mad King wasn't just a metaphor. Denmark was ruled in his name by regents, advisors, and later his son. Christian became a ghost of a monarch, a hollow shell propped up in paintings, portraits, and official processions like a broken puppet no one could bring themselves to throw away. So what's the lesson? If your monarch spends more time pleasuring himself than ruling, and your actual government is being run by a doctor with a libido and a vision board, maybe rethink the whole hereditary monarchy thing. Christian VII wasn't evil. He wasn't corrupt. He was just profoundly broken in public. And the tragedy is that no one dared step in before things spiraled into betrayal, beheadings, and a trail of discarded dignity that he wanted to be king. He just didn't know how. He wanted love. He just didn't know who he was. And he wanted peace, but all he had were nervous ministers, disappointed queens, and really awkward meetings. And so he ruled, or rather, he ruled by not ruling at all. Philip V of Spain. The king who spoke to corpses and believed his buttocks were made of glass. If ever there were a monarch who needed a therapist, a nap, and a spiritual exorcism all at once, it was Philip V of Spain. His reign was a roller coaster of depression, delusion, and decisions so unhinged they make Caligula look like a cautious intern. This is the story of a man who ruled a global empire while having full-blown mental breakdowns and late-night chats with dead people. Literally, Philip V was the grandson of Louis XIV of France. Yes, the Sun King himself, and inherited all the grandeur but none of the stability. When he became the first Bourbon King of Spain in 1700, people expected splendor, reform, maybe a few fashionable wars. Instead, what they got was a moody ghost whisperer with a royal obsession with death, doom, and occasionally his own butt. From the start, Philip showed signs of instability. He was anxious, introverted, prone to dark moods that made courtiers tiptoe through the halls like servants in a haunted mansion. His days were consumed with paranoia, and his nights were worse. He believed spirits came to visit him in the dark, whispering secrets and demanding strange rituals. He'd wake up the palace with screams, insist on sudden exorcisms, and once tried to expel demons by burning his own bed linens. Things got so bad that at one point, he refused to change his clothes or bathe for weeks. He wore the same filthy robe, reeking of incense and sweat, claiming cleanliness would let evil spirits enter his skin. Ministers had to bribe him into cutting his nails, which were so long they curled inward like talons. Picture the King of Spain ruling an empire the size of half the globe, looking like a possessed owl who lost a fight with a laundry basket. But wait, it gets better or worse. Philip became obsessed with death. Not his own, mind you, everyone else's. He started visiting the crypts of royal ancestors and holding long, whispered conversations with their corpses. There are documented reports of him spending entire nights in the royal burial chamber, speaking to the decomposed body of his first wife, Maria Louisa of Savoy, asking for advice on governance, on heaven, even on what to eat for breakfast. And when he wasn't chatting with skeletons, he was sinking into the glass delusion. Yes, like Charles VI of France, Philip started believing that his buttocks were made of glass. Not metaphorical glass. Real, fragile, crackable window pane as ***. He was terrified of sitting too hard, moving too fast, or letting anyone touch his lower half. Servants were ordered to carry silk cushions and lay them down wherever he paused. Even in the garden, even during war councils. One unlucky servant allegedly brushed past his royal rear during a procession, and Philip screamed, wept, and demanded the man be exiled for attempted murder. That man's crime? Endangering the structural integrity of His Majesty's royal cheeks. Now, it would be tragic enough if this were just a private royal meltdown. But remember, this man ruled Spain, and he ruled it during a crucial period of war, diplomacy, and global trade. While generals waited for orders, Philip might be lying in bed weeping over the voice of a dead queen. While ministers begged for his signature, he might be praying to the Virgin Mary to fortify his buttocks. At one point, he abdicated entirely, passing the crown to his son, Louis, in a fit of despair. But when Louis died a few months later from smallpox, Philip came right back to the throne like a ghost returning to a haunted house he hadn't finished ruining. It didn't help that his second wife, Elizabeth Farnese, was ambitious, manipulative, and not above exploiting her husband's broken brain. She would feed his delusions just enough to steer policy in her favor, then gaslight the entire court into obeying her as the true voice of reason. So Spain, effectively, was being run by a dead woman, a paranoid glass king, and an Italian queen with the charisma of a Bond villain. Foreign dignitaries were baffled. Letters from British and Austrian envoys read like horror novels, filled with phrases like "His Majesty weeps upon the wind," "He fears chairs," and refuses to acknowledge sunlight. The French were embarrassed, the English were delighted, and the Spanish nobility quietly wondered how much longer the empire could survive its leader treating political advisors like poltergeists. Philip reigned off and on for 45 years, managing to expand the Spanish navy and build new palaces, despite actively believing he might shatter at any moment. And while many of his reforms were driven by advisors or luck, not leadership, Spain limped forward, held together by faith, fear, and a whole lot of scented handkerchiefs. When Philip finally died in 1746, after years of isolation, hallucinations, and unpredictable behavior, the royal court sighed in relief, then held a massive funeral filled with incense, black velvet, and the silent prayer that nobody else in the family started talking to corpses again. What do we take from all this? Absolute. Power doesn't just corrupt. Sometimes it curls your toenails, isolates you in haunted bedrooms, and convinces you your booty is one bad fall from a national crisis. Philip V didn't want to be remembered as the king who whispered to coffins and patted his throne like a crystal dish, but history has a way of ignoring your official titles and clinging to your most fragile legacy. He ruled a dying empire while believing his butt was glass. And somehow, that's still not the most absurd royal we've covered yet. Ludwig II of Bavaria, the fairy tale king who built castles for ghosts and died in a lake born in 1845. Ludwig ascended to the throne of Bavaria at 18, tall, dreamy-eyed, and allergic to anything resembling normal governance. From the beginning, he made it clear he had no interest in politics, diplomacy, or attending cabinet meetings unless they were held in candlelit towers with dramatic orchestras playing in the background. Instead, he devoted himself entirely to art, music, and the Wagnerification of Bavaria. Yes, Richard Wagner, the composer of thunderous German operas about gods, knights, and doomed love, was Ludwig's spiritual North Star. The young king idolized Wagner so intensely that he summoned the composer to court, paid off his debts, and built him theaters. He called him the prophet of the true, the beautiful, and the sublime. Everyone else called him a drain on the royal budget. While Prussia unified Germany through war and Bismarckian bureaucracy, Ludwig retreated from reality. He rarely met with ministers, He stopped attending public events. He began sleeping during the day and working at night, issuing royal decrees by moonlight while servants tiptoed through his Gothic halls. The government functioned without him, which was fine because Ludwig was busy building castles. And not just any castles. Fantasy cathedrals. Architectural hallucinations. He built Neuschwanstein, the iconic structure that would one day inspire Disney's Cinderella Castle. Perched atop a Bavarian cliff, it was stuffed with frescoes of Tannhauser, swan motifs, and secret passageways. It had no throne room because Ludwig didn't care to rule. It had no ballroom because Ludwig preferred to dine alone. What it had was a grotto, indoors, with an artificial waterfall, because obviously he also commissioned Linderhof, a Baroque pleasure palace complete with a Venus grotto, a man-made lake, and an underground golden swan boat. He would ride it alone, surrounded by painted clouds and echoing Wagnerian music, dressed in silk robes, pretending to be Parsifal or Lohengrin. He talked to portraits. He wrote love letters to long-dead kings. He once built a mirror-lined dining room where he could dine with his reflection. By the 1880s, Ludwig had burned through millions of marks on his architectural fever dreams. Bavaria was broke. His ministers begged him to stop. He responded by planning yet another castle, Falkenstein, this time higher in the Alps, with turrets that stabbed the clouds and rooms themed entirely around medieval epics. No one could stop him. He simply borrowed more money from foreign banks, from private lenders, from whoever would fund one more staircase lined with golden griffins. His personal life, meanwhile, was equally operatic. Though engaged once to his cousin, a princess he barely tolerated, Ludwig never married. He was deeply closeted, painfully lonely, and likely gay in a time and place where that was dangerous knowledge. He formed intense attachments to male servants, artists, and actors. Many of his letters, now published, reveal a man tortured by desire and shame, longing for connection, terrified of exposure. His castles weren't just indulgence. They were escape pods. Eventually, the government had had enough. In 1886, they declared him insane. Based on testimonies from servants and doctors who hadn't even examined him, a psychiatric commission labeled him mentally unfit to rule. He was deposed. His uncle took the throne. Ludwig, now just a royal inconvenience, was sent to Berg Castle under supervision. 2 days later, Ludwig went for a walk by Lake Starnberg with his psychiatrist, Dr. Bernhard von Gudden. They never returned. Later that night, their bodies were found in the shallow water, Ludwig floating face down, von Gudden nearby with signs of struggle. No water was found in Ludwig's lungs. No autopsy was conducted. The official story? Drowning. The real story? A mystery soaked in royal scandal and conspiracy. Did Ludwig try to escape? Was he murdered to silence his secrets? Did he pull his psychiatrist into the water in a final, defiant act of operatic tragedy? No one knows. His death, like his life, became legend. In Bavaria today, he's not remembered as a failed king, but as the Dream King, a tortured soul who ruled not from a throne, but from a mountaintop balcony, eyes fixed on a horizon only he could see. Ludwig too may have ignored policy, bankrupted a kingdom, and lived in a world stitched together from Arius and moonlight, but he gave us beauty, mystery, and one unforgettable question. What if a king chose dreams over duty? Henry VIII of England, the king who invented divorce by chopping wives and founding his own church. When most monarchs wanted to get rid of a spouse, they faked a hunting accident, orchestrated some polite exile, or quietly poisoned their soup. Henry VIII looked at that playbook and said, "Too subtle." Instead, he left a body count, split with the Pope, and reshaped the future of Christianity, all in the name of reproductive disappointment. Born in 1491, Henry wasn't supposed to be king. He was the second son, the spare, more into hunting, music, and jousting than politics. But when his older brother Arthur died, young Henry was suddenly upgraded to heir and inherited both the crown and his dead brother's wife, Catherine of Aragon. Yes, that's right, his first wife was originally his sister-in-law. Welcome to royal Europe, where everyone's related and no one blinks. For a while, things were decent. Henry and Catherine seemed like a power couple. He was athletic, charming, and played the lute. She was intelligent, respected, and endlessly diplomatic. The only problem? Catherine kept giving birth to daughters and stillborn sons, and Henry, being tragically allergic to female heirs, decided God must be punishing him for marrying his brother's widow. Rather than, take responsibility or simply try harder at fatherhood, Henry went full biblical crisis mode. He began searching for an out. And when he laid eyes on Anne Boleyn, a sassy, educated lady-in-waiting with big eyes and bigger ambition, he decided she was destiny. There was just one problem. Divorce wasn't allowed, so Henry asked the Pope to annul his marriage. The Pope said no. Henry asked again. The Pope still said no. Henry stomped his feet through a theological tantrum and then, in one of the pettiest yet most influential moves in Western history, created his own damn church. In 1534, Henry passed the Act of Supremacy, declaring himself head of the Church of England. No Pope, no Rome, no Catholic rules. Now he could divorce, remarry, and rewrite God's opinion as needed. Priests blinked, bishops swallowed their fear, and Parliament, sensing their heads might be next, politely clapped. With the religious obstacle cleared, Henry married Anne Boleyn in secret. Catherine was exiled. The Pope was fuming. England officially broke from the Catholic Church. And then, finally, Anne got pregnant. Henry was convinced it would be a boy. It was a girl. Her name? Elizabeth. Yes, that Elizabeth, the one who would one day rule longer and smarter than all of them combined. But Henry, in typical short-sighted fashion, sulked and failed to produce more children. Henry got bored, then paranoid, then convinced she was cheating, plotting, and possibly bewitching him. In 1536, he had her arrested, charged with adultery, incest with her brother, and high treason. Most of the charges were nonsense. The result wasn't. Anne Boleyn was beheaded at the Tower of London, her neck snapped by a French swordsman specially imported for the occasion. Henry allegedly played tennis while it happened. Then came Jane Seymour, wife number 3, who finally gave him a male heir, Prince Edward. Henry was thrilled. Jane promptly died of childbirth complications. Henry was devastated for about 10 minutes. Then he moved on. Wife number 4 was Anne of Cleves, a German princess picked from a painting. Unfortunately, the painter lied. Henry met her in person and recoiled, calling her a Flanders mare. They were married for 6 months, never consummated the union, and then divorced amicably, and was paid off handsomely and outlived all his wives. Honestly, she won the whole game. Next was Catherine Howard, a teenager who brought energy, flirtation, and zero political sense to the marriage. She also brought a secret boyfriend. Henry, now obese, paranoid, and plagued with a festering leg wound, didn't take the betrayal well. Catherine was beheaded in 1542, screaming, "I die a queen," which, technically, she did. Wife number 6, Catherine Parr, was smart enough to play nurse, stepmom, and political ally without causing drama. She outlived Henry, outlived the court, and probably outlived the will to ever remarry again. Henry, meanwhile, died in 1547, bloated and infected, having taken England through 3 major religious shifts, 6 marriages, 2 wives' executions, and the dissolution of 800 monasteries just to fund his very expensive love life. His coffin reportedly leaked fluids during transport. Fitting, really. What's his legacy? A nation split from Rome, the rise of Protestantism, a daughter who became a legendary queen, and a permanent place in pop culture as the monarch who treated marriage like a blood sport. Henry didn't just want a son. He wanted control over fate itself. And when God, women, and Rome all said no, he replied, "I am the state, and I'm getting remarried." Nero, the man who fiddled while Rome burned, and then blamed the Christians. If history had a heavy metal soundtrack, Nero would be its frontman, shirtless, draped in gold, screaming poetry at the flames while Rome collapsed in the background. Born into the notoriously shady Julio-Claudian dynasty in 37 AD, Nero came preloaded with imperial baggage, power-hungry relatives, and a mother, Agrippina the Younger, who made Cersei Lannister look like a Girl Scout. Nero became emperor at the age of 16, which, even by Roman standards, was far too young to be trusted with a vast empire. His mother had schemed, married, and murdered her way into the perfect position to manipulate her teenage son from the shadows. First, it worked. Nero ruled under the guidance of tutors like Seneca, promoted arts, lowered taxes, and acted like he might actually be a decent emperor. People were cautiously optimistic. But then Nero hit puberty politically and personally and decided he was no one's puppet. His first major move? He had his mother killed. Not in a subtle way either. He tried poisoning her, collapsing her ceiling, and sabotaging her boat. When all else failed, he sent soldiers to stab her directly. According to legend, Agrippina's final words were, "Strike the womb that bore Nero." 10 points for drama. With his mother out of the way, Nero set out to redefine imperial duties. Instead of governing, he threw lavish orgies, hosted gladiator fights where he performed on stage, and forced senators to applaud his terrible poetry. He took up acting, singing, and chariot racing, dragging Rome's dignity through the mud while wearing silken tunics and eyeliner. But nothing, and I mean nothing, defines Nero like the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. The fire started in the middle of the night and raged for 6 days, devouring most of the city. People died. Temples collapsed. Markets turned to ash. It was one of the greatest disasters in ancient Roman history. And where was the emperor? Some sources say he was in Antium. Others say he was on a rooftop, dressed as a bard, playing a lyre, singing about the fall of Troy while watching his capital burn. Whether this is literal or symbolic, one thing is certain. Nero did not act like an emperor trying to save his people. And when the flames died and the citizens began asking questions, Nero did what any scandal-ridden egomaniac would do. He blamed someone else. Specifically, a small, unpopular religious group gaining traction in the empire, the Christians.it was the perfect political scapegoat. Nero accused them of arson, sacrilege, and conspiracy. Then he unleashed a reign of terror. Christians were torn apart by dogs, crucified in public gardens, and, most infamously, coated in pitch and set on fire to light Nero's evening parties. He would stroll among the burning bodies, sipping wine, murmuring verses, while guests tried not to vomit, and while Rome reeled, Nero got to work building his dream project, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, a sprawling, gold-leafed pleasure palace complete with artificial lakes, revolving dining rooms, and a 120-foot-tall bronze statue of himself as the sun god. He built this monument to his own narcissism on the ashes of the burned city, because subtlety was not in Nero's vocabulary. By now, even the Senate, which had tolerated his mother's murder, his wife's murder, oh yeah, he kicked his pregnant wife to death, and his complete abandonment of public duty, had had enough. Plots began forming. Whispers spread. Generals in the provinces started declaring independence. In 68 AD, the final nail dropped. The Senate declared Nero an enemy of the state. He fled Rome, abandoned by everyone except a few loyal freedmen. Hiding in a crumbling villa outside the city, Nero paced, wept, and muttered lines like, "What an artist dies in me," until he finally ordered his assistant to help him take his own life. The assistant stabbed him as Nero trembled. Too afraid to do it himself, he died at the age of 30. No funeral, no state honors. Just a grave in an unmarked ditch and a reputation so vile, the very name Nero became synonymous with madness, cruelty, and flame. And yet, like many villains with flair, Nero became legendary. Some blamed him for Rome's fall. Others romanticized his artistic soul. Throughout history, artists and despots alike have looked to Nero and whispered, "Maybe it's okay to set everything on fire if you play music while doing it." He ruled with ego, burned with jealousy, and died as he lived, in denial, in costume, and in flames. Charles VI of France, the king who thought he was made of glass and forgot he was king. If ever there was a monarch whose reign should have come with a handle with care label, it was Charles VI. Born in 1368, Charles was crowned King of France at age 11, but thanks to a regency, he didn't begin ruling directly until his early 20s. At first, everything seemed promising. Handsome, athletic, intelligent. He was nicknamed Charles the Beloved. The people adored him. The nobility trusted him. France was in a rough patch, sure, but maybe, just maybe, Charles would be the king to pull it all together. Then one day, Charles rode into the forest with his guards and came back insane. It happened in 1392. Charles was leading a military expedition when, suddenly, in the blazing heat, surrounded by trees and dust, he snapped. Without warning, he drew his sword and began attacking his own men, killing at least one. His eyes were wild, his face twisted. He screamed that enemies were everywhere. When the attack ended, Charles collapsed, catatonic, trembling in the dirt. It would not be the last episode. Over the next 4 decades, Charles would descend into one of the most documented and devastating mental illnesses in medieval royal history. His mind would vanish for weeks, months, even years at a time. He would forget who he was, refuse to bathe or change clothes, scream at invisible foes, and speak in riddles. One day he tried to murder his brother. Another day he thought he was St. George. He once ordered his palace halls filled with trees because the voices told him they needed shade. But the most bizarre and famous of all his delusions was his glass madness. Charles came to believe that he was made entirely of glass. Every inch of him, skin, bones, and organs, was fragile, see-through, and at risk of shattering at the slightest touch. He refused to sit down unless the chair was heavily padded. He made his servants wrap him in blankets and reinforce his clothes with iron rods, which made walking awkward and extremely loud. Courtiers were ordered to avoid sudden movements, never shout, and certainly never touch the king without warning. The man ruled France while dressed like a quilted scarecrow, convinced that a poorly placed elbow would turn him into royal confetti. The worst part? Nobody could tell him he was wrong. This was the king. To challenge him was treason. So the court complied. Nobles learned to bow from a distance. Advisors tiptoed through conversations. Aides developed special techniques for changing his clothes without triggering a mental collapse. France, already struggling with the 100 Years' War, was now led by a man who believed he was a living windowpane. As his episodes worsened, power shifted into the hands of whoever happened to be closest to him during moments of lucidity. His wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, and his brother, the Duke of Orleans, vied for influence, until the Duke was assassinated by John the Fearless of Burgundy, turning the French court into a blood-soaked chessboard. Civil war erupted, factions formed, and England, sensing opportunity, invaded again. Enter Henry V, the English king who crushed France at Agincourt while Charles was in one of his glassy trances. The French nobility, desperate for peace and lacking any hope that Charles could rule effectively, signed the Treaty of Troyes, disinheriting Charles's son and naming Henry V heir to the French throne. Charles, reportedly, didn't even understand what had happened. The King of France was a ghost in his own castle, wandering the halls, mumbling to himself, sometimes unaware he had children, a country, or a crown. The people renamed him Charles the Mad. His court kept up the charade. He was still dressed, fed, and presented ceremonially, but everyone knew the reality. France had no king. It had a shell with a crown, pacing softly across silk carpets, terrified of cracking. Charles died in 1422, after nearly 40 years of fractured rule. His death marked the end of the fragile silence that had gripped the court for decades. And yet, in a strange way, he left a legacy not of leadership but of vulnerability. His reign exposed the terrifying truth that even the most powerful men in the world can be broken beyond repair. That he was not evil, not cruel, just lost. Lost in a world of shadows and shattering illusions. A man imprisoned in his own mind, wrapped in blankets, ruling a kingdom from within a palace of imagined glass. And so he passed into history, not as a warrior or a conqueror, but as a warning that kings are human, that power does not protect against madness, and that sometimes the most dangerous battlefield is inside your own skull. Peter the Great, the Tsar who forced beards into extinction and personally operated execution devices, Peter the Great was not born with the patience of a philosopher. He was born with the energy of a caffeinated bear and the ambition of someone who saw medieval Russia and said, "Burn it all. We're starting over." At 6 feet 8 inches tall, towering over most of his subjects, Peter looked less like a traditional czar and more like a boss fight. He didn't believe in subtlety, diplomacy, or tradition. He believed in results. Born in 1672, Peter inherited a Russia that was big, slow, and stuck in the past. Still clinging to feudalism, superstition, and boyars, Russian nobles with wardrobes from the Dark Ages. Peter hated all of it. He wanted ships, science, cities, cannons, clean streets, shaved faces, and respect from Europe. So he decided to westernize Russia by any means necessary. And when I say any, I mean any. He started by going undercover. Literally. In 1697, Peter disguised himself as a common laborer and joined a diplomatic mission through Europe called the Grand Embassy. He worked in shipyards in the Netherlands, studied artillery in Prussia, and even tried dentistry in England. Yes, he pulled people's teeth just for fun. He wanted to learn how Europe worked from the ground up, and he wasn't afraid to get his enormous royal hands dirty. When he returned to Russia, he went full scorched earth on tradition. Beards? Gone. He imposed a beard tax, forcing noblemen to either shave or pay to keep their facial hair. If you wanted to keep your manly mane, you had to carry around a little bronze token proving you'd paid the beard fee. Guards at city gates carried razors, and if they caught you unpaid and fuzzy, they'd shave you on the spot. To Peter, a beard wasn't just hair, it was backwardness. Clothes changed. Anyone wearing traditional Russian robes got side-eyed by the state. Peter ordered courtiers to wear German jackets, French cuffs, and English boots. If you didn't adapt fast enough, you might find yourself socially executed or, if unlucky, actually executed. Because Peter didn't do warnings, he reformed the military, built a navy from scratch, and founded the city of St. Petersburg on a swamp, turning it into a glittering European-style capital at the cost of tens of thousands of serf lives. People died of cold, disease, exhaustion. Peter didn't flinch. He once said, "I build for posterity," which loosely translated into, "You die now so my empire looks cooler later." But Peter didn't just direct violence, he participated. After crushing a rebellion by the Streltsy, elite royal guards who didn't appreciate modernization, he personally took up an axe and executed several of them himself. He made nobles attend the executions as a lesson. His message was clear: adapt or perish. I'll even help you perish. Peter's obsession with reform bled into every aspect of life. He modernized the calendar, introduced secular schools, restructured the government, and created a Senate to rubber stamp his ideas. He even demanded that noble families send their sons abroad for education, so they could come back acting like proper Western Europeans instead of vodka-soaked medieval wood sprites. And yet, for all his brutality and impatience, Peter was undeniably effective. Under his rule, Russia went from backwater giant to imperial power. He built industries, ports, printing presses, and diplomatic alliances. He defeated Sweden in the Great Northern War and finally gave Russia access to the Baltic Sea. A dream for every czar before him. He didn't just change Russia, he transformed it. But the man himself remained intense. He drank excessively, threw parties that could humble Roman emperors, and had a sadistic streak. He tortured his own son, Alexei, for plotting against him and may have personally killed him during interrogation. Peter believed the state came first. Family, emotions, and morals came somewhere far behind. When Peter died in 1725, after diving into icy waters to rescue sailors during a storm, he left no clear successor and a nation reeling from both admiration and trauma. Statues were erected. Myths were born. Some called him a savior, others a tyrant. But no one, absolutely no one, forgot him. Peter the Great was the kind of leader who grabbed history by the beard and shaved it. He didn't wait for progress. He hunted it down, dragged it to Russia, and forced it to sit at the imperial table, screaming if necessary. Vlad the Impaler, the prince who gave Dracula his brand and turned war into a forest of spikes, born in 1431 in Transylvania, Vlad III was not just any noble brat. He was the son of Vlad II Dracal, a member of the Order of the Dragon, a knightly group sworn to defend Christianity and, incidentally, the inspiration for his son's nickname, Dracula, meaning son of the dragon. His childhood? Oh, just the usual. Noble titles, military drills, and a few years as a political hostage of the Ottoman Empire. Because why not start life with trauma? As a hostage in Edirne, young Vlad learned a few things. Politics is a game of betrayal, pain is a language of power, and you survive by becoming scarier than your enemies. And boy, did he take that lesson to heart. When he finally returned to Wallachia to claim the throne, he brought with him not just political ambition, but a philosophy carved in blood. Wallachia at the time was a geopolitical chew toy, caught between the Hungarian kingdom and the Ottoman Empire. If you ruled it, you had to be ruthless. Vlad wasn't just ruthless. He perfected ruthlessness into an art form. His favorite medium? Impaling. Imagine this. Long wooden stakes, sharpened at one end, bodies slid down them alive, gravity pulling them inch by agonizing inch, organs rearranged by splinters, death taking hours or even days. This wasn't just punishment, it was theater. Vlad would arrange the corpses in patterns, circles, lines, forests of the dead, to send a message. His message was simple: fear me or become decor. During his second reign in the late 1450s, Vlad embarked on what can only be described as a fear campaign. He didn't just execute criminals. He impaled boyars, nobles, merchants, foreign envoys, rival factions, thieves, lovers, beggars. Anyone who defied his rule or looked at him sideways. One Easter, he invited the noble families of Wallachia to a feast, then had them arrested mid-meal, forced them to march hundreds of miles, and worked them to death building his fortress. When Ottoman envoys refused to remove their turbans before meeting him, citing religious custom, Vlad had the turbans nailed to their skulls. Diplomacy, Dracula style. But his piece de resistance came in 1462, when Sultan Mehmed II marched into Wallachia with a massive army to crush Vlad. As the Ottomans approached the capital, they found themselves face to face with the forest of the impaled. Over 20,000 corpses, rotting in rows, staked in horrifying stillness under the sun. The smell alone could kill a horse. The psychological impact, even stronger. Mehmed, one of the most feared warriors of his time, looked at the scene, gagged, and retreated. Vlad had won the war before a single arrow flew. But as you might guess, this kind of PR strategy has a short shelf life. Vlad's reign was a revolving door of betrayals, exiles, and temporary victories. His enemies weren't just external. The Wallachian nobility hated him, neighboring rulers feared him, and even his allies started double-checking their drinks. He was captured by Hungary in 1462 and spent over a decade imprisoned. When he was finally released and restored to power in 1476, he lasted only a few months. He died, ironically, considering his obsession with death in battle. The exact details are murky. Some say he was betrayed by his own men. Others say he died fighting. What we do know is this: his head was cut off, sent to the Sultan in a jar of honey, and displayed on a spike in Constantinople as a warning to others who dared be as terrifying as him. But Vlad's legacy didn't die. Centuries later, Bram Stoker would borrow his nickname, Dracula, and turn it into fiction's most enduring vampire. But the real Vlad didn't drink blood. He spilled it, by the gallon. He didn't stalk castles at night. He turned kingdoms into nightmares in broad daylight. He was no monster hiding in the shadows. He was the shadow. To some Romanians, Vlad is still considered a national hero, an iron-fisted ruler who defended his land from foreign domination. To others, he's the blueprint of tyranny. One man's patriot is another man's psychopath. But either way, one thing is certain: when Vlad ruled, fear ruled with him. Christian 7 of Denmark. The king who masturbated through cabinet meetings and let his doctor run the country, born in 1749, Christian was never what you'd call emotionally stable. From childhood, he showed signs of what we'd now call severe mental illness, possibly schizophrenia, certainly anxiety, and definitely a flair for disruption. But back then, psychiatry wasn't exactly a royal science. Instead, they called him delicate, handed him a crown, and told him not to touch anything too expensive. That plan failed immediately. At just 17, Christian ascended the throne of Denmark and Norway. But instead of acting like a monarch, he treated the palace like a chaotic playground. He was manic, fidgety, and prone to laughing at funerals. He'd pull pranks on courtiers, slap ministers mid-meeting, and bark like a dog at ambassadors. Oh, and he masturbated. Constantly. In fact, he masturbated so much that it became a documented political issue. Foreign dignitaries wrote letters about it. Royal advisors begged him to stop. He reportedly pleasured himself during state dinners, cabinet sessions, and while greeting foreign officials. The phrase "hands-on monarch" took on an entirely unfortunate meaning. But Christian wasn't evil, just deeply unwell. And while Denmark stumbled through this storm of royal awkwardness, a new figure entered the scene. Johann Friedrich Struensee, a German physician with Enlightenment ideals and dangerous levels of competence. Originally brought in to stabilize Christian's mental state, Struensee quickly realized the king wasn't just unwell, he was vacant. The throne was empty in everything but name. So Struensee did what any ambitious 18th century doctor might do when standing near a drooling, disinterested monarch. He took over. First, he gained the king's trust. Then he became his shadow, writing Christian speeches, drafting legislation, and whispering policies into his ear. Before long, Struensee was signing royal decrees himself, issuing more than 1,000 progressive reforms in under 2 years. He abolished torture, liberalized the press, modernized schools, and even gave rights to unmarried mothers. Denmark went from feudal fog to Enlightenment espresso practically overnight. And did I mention that he was sleeping with the queen? Yes, while running the country and puppeteering the king, Struensee also entered a full-blown affair with Queen Caroline Matilda, Christian's neglected, intelligent British wife. The king, barely aware of the affair, seemed more interested in his own hands than his royal bed. Meanwhile, Caroline and Struensee were riding horses together at dawn, exchanging coded love letters, and raising the king's son while possibly making a new one. But in court politics, nothing this spicy stays secret forever. The conservative nobles and Queen Dowager Juliana Maria hated Struensee's liberal reforms, and the fact that a foreign doctor was running the country and dating the queen. In 1772, they staged a coup. Struensee was arrested during a masked ball, dragged from his mistress's side, and thrown into a cell. What followed was one of the ugliest political trials in Danish history. Struensee was tortured, forced to confess to seducing the queen and corrupting the king, and then publicly executed. First his hand was chopped off, then his head. His body was quartered and displayed like a butcher's special. As for Caroline Matilda, she was exiled to Germany, separated from her children, and died of illness at age 23. Her love story ended in tragedy, her letters burned, her name erased from court portraits. Christian, he remained on the throne in name only, retreating further into confusion, delusions, and lonely rituals. The real power passed to a regency council, and the masturbating monarch faded into a quiet, trembling figure in Denmark's background noise. Christian VII died in 1808 after over 4 decades of not really ruling. He left behind a country that had been momentarily enlightened, violently corrected, and thoroughly scandalized. His reign is remembered not for war or diplomacy, but for mental illness, revolutionary reform, and one hell of a love triangle. So next time someone tells you that royals have it easy, remember this: one man's crown is another man's burden. And sometimes the greatest threat to a kingdom isn't war or famine or politics. It's a king who can't stop touching himself in public. Caligula, the emperor who made his horse a priest and declared himself a living god, born Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus in 12 AD. He was affectionately nicknamed Caligula, meaning little boots, because as a child he used to strut around Roman military camps dressed like a tiny soldier. It was adorable until it wasn't, because behind those little boots was a man who would grow up to turn the most powerful empire in the world into an absurdist stage play soaked in blood, ego, and horse manure. Caligula's early life was riddled with trauma. His father, the respected General Germanicus, died mysteriously when Caligula was just 7. His family became the target of palace intrigue. His mother and 2 brothers were accused of treason and either starved or executed. And little Caligula? He was forced to play the good boy, nodding politely while watching emperors murder his relatives. He learned that survival meant smiling while the knives went in. When Emperor Tiberius died in 37 AD, Caligula inherited the throne at just 24. Rome rejoiced. Statues were erected. Prayers were offered. The Senate breathed a sigh of relief. At last, a young, popular ruler from a beloved military lineage. Surely the empire was safe now. Then, 6 months later, he cracked. No one knows exactly what did it. Some say it was a severe illness. Others whisper about poisoning or demonic possession. Whatever it was, the Caligula who emerged was not the same man they had crowned. He started by bankrupting the treasury with wild spending. Gladiator games? Non-stop. Chariot races? Every weekend. He flooded the Colosseum to stage naval battles with real ships. He handed out gold to strangers in the streets and commissioned golden statues of himself. When the money ran out, he taxed everything. Lawsuits, marriages, prostitution, even the collecting of sea sponges. Then came the deification. Caligula declared himself a living god. Not metaphorically, literally. He demanded to be worshipped alongside Jupiter and would stroll through the palace dressed as Mercury, Venus, or Apollo. complete with wigs and divine accessories. Temples were rededicated to him, sacrifices offered. Priests ordered to refer to him not as Caesar, but as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. And woe unto anyone who forgot it. He began speaking to the moon, held conversations with statues, built a floating palace on a barge. He'd invite senators to dinner, then burst into laughter, announcing that he could have them all executed on a whim. One day he ordered an entire section of the audience at a gladiator match thrown into the arena to be torn apart by wild animals because he was bored. And then there was the horse. Caligula adored his stallion, Incitatus, beyond all measure. The horse had a marble stable, an ivory manger, a purple blanket, and a collar of precious stones. But Caligula didn't stop at luxury. He made Incitatus a priest. Then he planned to appoint him as consul, Rome's highest political office, because, in his words, he's less of an ass than the senators. It wasn't just a joke. It was a middle finger to the Senate, a declaration that even a horse could govern better than the corrupt elite. And they had to pretend it made sense or risk execution. Meanwhile, Caligula's personal life spiraled deeper into the abyss. He's accused of sleeping with his sisters, mocking the gods, and forcing noble women into prostitution for palace amusement. He once told the crowd at the Colosseum, "I wish all of Rome had one neck, so I could cut it." People stopped laughing. They started whispering. The fear turned from theatrical to real. Finally, in 41 AD, just 4 years into his reign, a group of guards led by Cassius Chaereas snapped. They cornered Caligula in a palace hallway and stabbed him 30 times. His wife and infant daughter were murdered too. The Senate tried to restore the Republic, but the Praetorian Guard installed Caligula's uncle Claudius as emperor the next day. The empire rolled on. The madness was over, for now. But Caligula left a mark, not of greatness or glory or strategy, but of chaos. His reign is the reason we remember how terrifying unrestrained power can be in the hands of a lunatic with too much gold and too little oversight. He turned Rome into a satire, made cruelty a performance, and forced the empire to stare into the mirror and see a clown with a knife. Emperor Elagabalus, the teenage priest-emperor who married a Vestal virgin and threw banquets for flies. Elagabalus was born in 203 AD as Varius Avitus Bassianus in Syria. At age 14, thanks to a scheming grandmother, a forged lineage to the Severan dynasty, and a military revolt, he suddenly found himself crowned emperor of Rome. 14. Most kids his age were worrying about acne. Elagabalus was sacrificing bulls to the sun god on the Senate floor and declaring himself the divine vessel of a foreign deity called Elagabal, after whom he renamed himself. Modest beginnings? Not exactly. Almost immediately, he horrified traditional Roman elites by trying to replace Jupiter, the king of the Roman gods, with Elagabal, a black stone from Syria that he paraded around Rome in a golden chariot. He built a lavish temple on the Palatine Hill for his god, filled it with incense, gold, dancers, and, depending on the source, questionable fluids. He insisted all other Roman deities bow to Elagabal, and even planned a divine marriage between his god and the goddess Minerva, complete with ceremony, dowry, and scandalized priests. But religion was just the warm-up. Elagabalus approached gender and sexuality with the same enthusiasm he applied to everything else, with zero regard for Roman norms and maximum flair. He wore makeup, dressed in women's clothing, and insisted on being called lady, empress, or queen. He often hosted Senate meetings while reclining in silk gowns. He married 5 times, including once to a Vestal virgin, an act so sacrilegious that ancient Romans probably choked on their wine. That marriage alone was enough to risk divine wrath. Elagabalus married her anyway, then went back to choosing lovers from the palace guards and street performers with the same energy most people apply to ordering lunch. According to historical gossip, and there's a lot, Elagabalus offered rewards to any physician who could give him a sex change surgery. He allegedly referred to himself as a woman and told people he had the soul of a female. Some historians today even suggest Elagabalus may have been transgender, though whether that's true or just ancient Rome being ancient Rome is still debated. What's certain is that Elagabalus didn't care what anyone thought. He lived as he pleased with full imperial backing. His dinner parties? Legendary. He once served guests fake food made of wood and wax, just to watch them pretend to enjoy it. At another banquet, he released wild animals into the dining room mid-course. Sometimes, the surprise under guests' plates wasn't dessert. It was live snakes. And in what might be the most delightfully petty act of all, he once held a grand feast only for flies, yes, literal flies, leaving rotting meat around the palace and declaring the banquet well attended. Elagabalus also delighted in bureaucratic anarchy. He appointed chariot racers, actors, and dancers to high office. He demoted experienced generals because they were boring. At one point, he announced Rome would be governed by astrological signs and fired anyone whose birth chart didn't vibe with his. He flooded the Senate with decrees about fashion, cosmetics, and preferred perfume blends. Meanwhile, the empire? Yeah, that was collapsing under its own weight. But not everyone was amused. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite imperial bodyguards, went from confused to concerned to deeply homicidal. They were loyal to the throne, but not to the orgy of chaos that sat on it. Behind the scenes, Elagabalus' own grandmother, the same woman who put him in power, realized she might have made a tiny mistake by handing the empire to a glitter-drenched tornado. She shifted her support to his cousin, Alexander Severus, a polite, rule-following boy with no known fly banquets on his risume in 222 AD. Just 4 years into his reign, Elagabalus was murdered in the palace baths by the Praetorians, along with his mother. Their bodies were dragged through the streets, thrown into the Tiber, and scrubbed from official records. His cousin took over. The temples were cleared. The makeup was wiped away. Rome returned to normal, if such a thing ever existed. Yet for all the gossip and scandal, Elagabalus left behind a legacy that still fascinates. Was he a misunderstood teenager struggling with identity in a world of power? A genuine spiritual revolutionary? Or just a fabulously over-the-top maniac with a divine complex and zero impulse control? Whatever the case, he remains one of history's most unforgettable emperors. Not because he conquered lands or rewrote law, but because he ruled Rome like it was Studio 54 and died as fabulously as he lived. Queen Joanna of Castile, the queen who slept beside her husband's corpse for years. Joanna was born in 1479, the third child of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the royal power couple who unified Spain and financed a guy named Columbus to go sailing west. Joanna, raised for diplomacy and duty, was smart, educated, multilingual, and politically useful. In 1496, She was married off to Philip the Handsome, Duke of Burgundy, to strengthen ties with the Habsburgs. Spoiler: no one stayed emotionally healthy in this marriage. Now let's talk about Philip. He was tall, blonde, athletic, and, according to every contemporary, obscenely beautiful. His nickname wasn't ironic. But beneath that face was a political schemer and world-class womanizer. While Joanna fell for him like a Shakespearean heroine, Philip treated her like decorative furniture. Nice to look at, easy to move, and replaceable with any available mistress. Joanna, deeply in love, watched helplessly as Philip cavorted across Europe. But this wasn't your typical royal infidelity. Joanna didn't grit her teeth and look the other way. She snapped. When she caught one of his mistresses, she reportedly beat the woman senseless and cut off her hair with a dagger. She screamed, wept, clung, begged, and raged. Her passion wasn't regal. It was volcanic. The court whispered. The priests frowned. The diagnosis was whispered. La loca. Still, Joanna wasn't just a lovesick teenager. She had a kingdom. When her elder siblings died one by one, she became the heir to Castile and Aragon, making her the future ruler of all of Spain. But every time she tried to claim her role, men around her conspired to stop her. First her husband, then her father, then her son. All three would rule in her name while keeping her locked behind castle walls. Then, in 1506, something cracked. Again. Philip the Handsome, just 28, died suddenly of a fever after drinking cold water post-tennis. Some said it was poison. Others called it plague. Joanna didn't care. Her world collapsed. But where most would weep and move on, Joanna refused to bury him. She kept his body in a coffin, refused to let it out of her sight, and ordered it opened so she could kiss his feet. The court was horrified. Priests tried to intervene. Joanna doubled down. She ordered that no woman could come near the coffin, even nuns. She traveled through Castile with the corpse for months, allegedly opening the casket to talk to Philip or just sit beside him. At night, she slept in rooms next to him, draped in black, speaking to his embalmed face. Rumors swirled. Some claimed she had the body exhumed multiple times. Others insisted she believed he would rise again. Whatever the truth, her grief blurred into obsession, and her obsession into institutional legend. Her father Ferdinand finally stepped in, not to comfort her, but to declare her mentally unfit to rule. He locked her in the convent of Tordesillas, where she remained a prisoner for nearly 50 years. Her son, Charles V, inherited the empire and carried on the family tradition of ruling while pretending Joanna didn't exist. She wasn't allowed to bathe, see the sun, or speak to more than a handful of people. Servants were ordered to ignore her delusions and never mention her husband. She remained stubborn. She rarely spoke. She rarely ate. But she never renounced her title as queen. Even as time erased the world she knew, Joanna clung to her identity and to the ghost of Philip. In her final years, she would sit in the dark, whispering prayers, clutching mementos, and sometimes singing lullabies to no one. When she died in 1555, age 75, the world had long forgotten her reign. Her son ruled Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and half of Europe. Her name had become a metaphor, La Loca, a warning, a shadow. But peel away the cruelty of the label, and what you find is not just madness. It's a woman trapped in grief, betrayed by family, robbed of power, and exiled for feeling too deeply in a world that only valued control. Juana la Loca wasn't mad because she loved. She was declared mad because her love made powerful men uncomfortable. Charles VI of France, the king who thought he was made of glass, born in 1368, Charles ascended to the French throne at age 11, inheriting a country wrecked by the 100 Years' War, plagues, and court intrigue that could curdle milk. Initially, there was hope. His early reign was promising. Known as Charles the Beloved, he was intelligent, idealistic, and surrounded by capable advisors, including his wise uncle Philip the Bold. The people loved him, the nobles admired him, and then, at the tender age of 24, something in his mind quietly, devastatingly snapped. It began with whispers, mood swings, paranoia, long silences interrupted by shouting fits. Then came the full collapse. In 1392, while leading a military expedition, Charles was riding through a forest when a page dropped a lance with a loud clatter. The sound startled the king. He drew his sword and attacked his own men, killing several before collapsing from exhaustion. When he awoke, he remembered nothing. The doctors called it madness. The court called it an incident. Charles would call it Tuesday from then on. His mind unraveled in slow-motion horror. He would disappear for days inside the palace, speaking to no one. Sometimes he didn't recognize his wife or children. Other times he forgot he was king entirely. He insisted his name was not Charles, that he had never ruled France. Then came the glass. At the height of his illness, Charles became convinced that he was made entirely of glass. Not metaphorically, literally. He believed that any touch, any jolt, any wrong movement might shatter him into 1,000 shards. He wore reinforced clothing and iron rods sewn into his robes to protect his body from breaking. He refused to let people approach him, begged his servants to tread lightly, and sat motionless for hours, trembling with terror at being bumped. He reportedly ordered special precautions in the palace: softer furniture, padded floors, quieter footfalls. There were times he wore steel corsets under his royal garments. In public processions, attendants would walk beside him slowly, not to protect him from assassins or arrows, but from accidental shoulder brushes. Meanwhile, France imploded, the court split into factions. One led by his ambitious brother Louis of Orleans, the other by his cunning cousin John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. They fought viciously for control over the throne's decisions, hiding behind the curtain of Charles's illness. His queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, was trapped in the middle, forced to act as a regent while nobles whispered that she was the real power behind the crown, or worse, the cause of his madness. Civil war erupted. The Orleanists and Burgundians spilled blood in the streets of Paris. One night in 1407, Duke John had Louis assassinated on a dark street, claiming it was for the good of France. Charles, still king in name, was too far gone to respond. He sometimes screamed at shadows. Other times he wept for no reason. On certain days he believed he was St. George. On others he ran howling through the corridors in torn clothes. Yet he wasn't always mad. That was the cruelest part. Charles had lucid periods, days or weeks when his mind cleared, when he spoke clearly, issued orders, even remembered his children's names. Hope would return. Then, just as quickly, he would vanish again into the fog, convinced once more that a handshake might kill him. By the 1420s, the English had taken advantage of France's royal chaos and invaded again. Henry V of England forced Charles to sign the Treaty of Troyes, which disinherited his own son, the future Charles VII, and declared Henry as heir to the French crown. Charles VI signed it. Perhaps he didn't know what he was doing. Perhaps he thought he was signing a delivery receipt. Or perhaps he believed that France, too, was glass, and already shattered beyond repair. That he died in 1422, age 53, after 3 decades of being king in body but rarely in mind. When he passed, the people wept not because they had lost a great ruler, but because they had never really had one. His tomb bears his royal name, but in the minds of historians, he is remembered as Charles the Mad, a monarch who lived in the royal palace but existed in a prison built from illusions and fear. Charles VI wasn't evil. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't corrupt. He was sick, profoundly and tragically sick. His reign reminds us that beneath the crown lies a human being, sometimes fragile, sometimes broken, and that the cost of power is often paid not in gold, but in sanity. Ludwig II of Bavaria, the Swan King who built fairy tale castles and drowned in mystery. If you've ever looked at a Disney castle and thought, who in their right mind designed something this magical? The answer is someone not entirely in their right mind. Ludwig II of Bavaria was the king who turned royal duties into stagecraft, built palaces that looked like they belonged in a fever dream, and then vanished into a lake under circumstances so bizarre, conspiracy theorists are still foaming at the mouth. Ludwig was born in 1845 into the House of Wittelsbach, a family that had ruled Bavaria for centuries and had more titles than actual accomplishments. From the start, Ludwig stood out. Tall, handsome, withdrawn, and completely enchanted by myths, music, and moonlight. While other princes studied military tactics, Ludwig was reading Wagner librettos and sketching towers in the margins of his textbooks. He once told a tutor, "I want to remain an eternal mystery to myself and others." Mission accomplished. When his father died suddenly in 1864, 18-year-old Ludwig was thrust onto the throne. Completely unprepared, untrained, and frankly uninterested in the actual business of ruling. Parliamentary meetings bored him. Budget reports gave him migraines. He rarely spoke in council sessions and once said he found government offensively real. What he wanted, instead, was to create beauty. And so, while Bavaria struggled with wars, unification, and the rise of Bismarck, Ludwig poured his energy into his true passion: architecture and art. He built palaces. So many palaces, enchanted palaces, Gothic palaces, castles shaped like crowns, castles modeled after opera stages, castles that had no actual use except to stand in a forest looking gorgeously insane. The most famous? Neuschwanstein Castle, a snow-dusted fantasy perched on a mountain like something plucked from a dream. Spiral turrets, mosaic floors, golden chandeliers in rooms built to host nobody. It wasn't a palace. It was a personal shrine to Richard Wagner, the composer Ludwig idolized like a rock star and possibly loved with an intensity that history is still trying to label. Ludwig's obsession with Wagner bordered on cosmic. He bankrolled the composer's career, built a private theater for his works, and spent hours alone reenacting operatic scenes in candlelight. He even had portraits of himself dressed as Wagnerian heroes painted, complete with swords, swan armor, and flowing locks that definitely didn't match his real hairline. Bavaria was broke. Ludwig didn't care. The state begged him to govern. He retreated deeper into fantasy. He rode in sleighs at night through the mountains, not to visit people but to talk to the moon. He rarely spoke to ministers and instead left notes under locked doors. He installed a dining table on pulleys so he wouldn't have to see servants. The food would simply rise from the floor like magic. His only company most nights? Swan statues, velvet drapes, and imagined applause. Naturally, rumors swirled. Some said he was mad. Others whispered he was in love with men but too afraid to act on it openly. He never married, and his one engagement was quietly called off after a few stiffly written letters and an even stiffer conversation with his fiancée, who allegedly left in tears, saying, "He only kissed the mirror." By the 1880s, Bavaria was drowning in Ludwig's debts. Ministers panicked. The king owed more than a decade's worth of tax revenue. The castles were consuming millions. He was reportedly designing a new palace inspired by Versailles, with no bedrooms. When advisors begged him to stop, he replied, "I am building for eternity." Bavaria replied, "We have bills due next Thursday." In 1886, the government acted. A panel of doctors, who never actually examined Ludwig, declared him insane. They had evidence. His isolation, his extravagance, the moonlit monologues. The diagnosis? Paranoia and incurable megalomania. They sent guards to arrest him. On June 12th, Ludwig was deposed. The next day, he went for a walk with his psychiatrist, Dr. Bernhard von Gudden, around Lake Starnberg. It was misty, quiet. The king was subdued, perhaps resigned. He said he wanted fresh air. The guards let them walk alone. They never came back. Hours later, both bodies were found floating in the lake. No witnesses, no struggle marks. Official cause, drowning. But here's the twist. Ludwig was an excellent swimmer. He once dove into a frozen river on a dare. His lungs showed no signs of water inhalation. Some believe he was shot. Others say he killed the doctor, then himself. One theory suggests royal assassins ensured the insane king wouldn't return, and no one knows. His body was buried in Munich. His castles were open to the public. And Neuschwanstein, the dream palace that nearly bankrupted a nation, became Germany's most visited tourist attraction. Disney copied its design. Filmmakers shot epic scenes there. Generations later, the man they called mad gave the world a template for magic. Ludwig too ruled through illusion, built in defiance of reason, and died as mysteriously as he lived. His mind may have cracked under loneliness and pressure, but it created beauty that still stands against time. He once said, "I wish to remain an eternal enigma." And he did. He was never a king in the practical sense. He was an artist, a dreamer, a man out of sync with reality, but perfectly at home in myth. Now, shall we continue the royal madness with Mach 9, Henry VIII of England, the king who invented divorce by chopping wives and founding his own church? Sultan Ibrahim I, the sultan who drowned his entire harem over a rumor. Ibrahim was born in 1615, the youngest son of Sultan Ahmed I, and he had what historians politely call a trauma-soaked childhood. While his brothers ruled the empire, Ibrahim spent 2 decades locked in the cafes, a gilded prison for royal heirs, essentially a velvet-walled cage designed to keep future sultans out of trouble and prevent them from being assassinated. It also happened to drive most of them insane. By the time his brother Sultan Murad IV died in 1640, Ibrahim was the last male heir left standing. But when the messengers came to tell him he was now Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, Ibrahim refused to leave his room. He thought it was a trick to kill him. It took several officials and his mother to convince him that no, he really was emperor now. Reluctantly, suspiciously, trembling, Ibrahim stepped into power. At first, things looked promising. His mother, Kozum Sultan, acted as regent, and she was sharp, ruthless, and experienced. For a while, the empire ran smoothly until Ibrahim realized he could do anything he wanted. That's when things got wet. Ibrahim became obsessed with women. Not in the way that powerful men often are, he took it to Olympic levels. His harem swelled to 280 concubines. He demanded only the plumpest women, declaring thinness to be a sign of ill health and treason. He once ordered his viziers to find the fattest woman in the empire. They returned with a 300-pound lady nicknamed Shekerpear, sugar cube, and he instantly made her his favorite. He would lavish his favorites with jewels, perfumes, furs, and palaces. He once tied emeralds to a cat and watched it pace across the carpet. He had fur-lined walls installed in parts of the Topkapi Palace. He distributed enormous sums of money just to make it rain coins over his harem's garden. It wasn't ruling. It was fevered indulgence. And yet, beneath the silks and sighs, paranoia still gnawed at him. Ibrahim believed that everyone was trying to poison him. He rotated food tasters daily. He once ordered an entire kitchen crew drowned because a pastry was too bitter. He distrusted his ministers, his advisors, and even his mother. But it was his harem that would suffer the most. One day, someone whispered a rumor. "Your concubines are sleeping with other men." There was no evidence, no witnesses, just a rumor. But that was all Ibrahim needed. In a frenzy of rage and humiliation, the Sultan gave an unthinkable order. Bind them, weigh them down, throw them into the Bosphorus. That day, more than 200 women, concubines, servants, attendants were drowned. Some say it was 280. Others say the number was uncountable. What is certain is that the palace ran red with roses the next morning, scattered by the wind from a courtyard that now stood silent. The empire was shaken. Even for a sultan with absolute power, this was too much. The people called him Ibrahim the Crazy. The court feared him. The Janissaries, elite Ottoman soldiers, began to murmur. And his mother? She began plotting. In 1648, Kozum Sultan and a group of high officials had Ibrahim deposed. He was locked away, removed from the throne. His young son, Mehmed IV, was installed as the new sultan. Ibrahim didn't rage. He didn't scream. He simply stared at the walls, whispering things no one could understand. Weeks later, under orders from the court, he was strangled with a silk cord. He died at 32. The empire survived him, but barely. His reign left deep scars on his people, on the palace, and in the river. Today, Sultan Ibrahim is remembered not for great battles or grand reforms, but for madness sharpened by fear, for trusting no one, loving too much, and destroying everything when the shadows spoke too loudly. From velvet cages to watery graves. His story reminds us what happens when paranoia wears a crown, and no one dares to take it off. Queen Christina of Sweden. the monarch who abdicated the throne, dressed as a man, and rode off into Catholic Europe, born in 1626. Christina came into the world during a thunderstorm. Her father Gustavus Adolphus reportedly thrilled because the newborn had such strong limbs. He mistook her for a boy. When told she was a girl, he supposedly replied, "She'll be clever then." He was right, possibly to a fault. Christina was raised as his heir, groomed to rule like a prince, not a princess. She studied philosophy, languages, politics, military strategy. By 18, she was running Sweden with the intelligence of a scholar and the mood swings of someone who stayed up too late reading Descartes. From the beginning, she refused to conform. She wore men's clothes, walked with a swagger, swore like a soldier, and refused to comb her hair or act ladylike for anyone. Ambassadors wrote letters home describing her as short, wild-eyed, talks like a man and walks like a dragoon. She was also brilliant, hosting philosophers, scientists, and artists at court. She corresponded with René Descartes, invited him to Stockholm, and then accidentally worked him to death by making him lecture at 5 a.m. in the freezing cold. Oops. The nobility predictably panicked. Sweden had never seen a queen like her. She read too much, argued too hard, prayed too little, and refused to marry. Her advisors begged her to choose a husband. She toyed with the idea, then changed her mind. Then toyed again. Then threatened to name her cousin as heir and vanish into the woods. But it wasn't just marriage she hated. It was monarchy itself. The weight of the crown crushed her. She loathed court rituals, ceremonial outfits, and being treated like a living symbol. By her mid-20s, she was done. Like, emotionally, spiritually, diplomatically done. In 1654, Christina summoned her court and dropped a bombshell. She was abdicating, just quitting. A sitting monarch, voluntarily. The Swedish nobles froze. This was not how monarchy worked, but she was unmoved. She officially transferred power to her cousin, Charles X, renounced her title and declared herself a free woman. Then she rode off, literally, out of Sweden, dressed in men's clothing, sword at her hip, horse beneath her, headed toward the Catholic South. Because yes, while she was at it, Christina also decided to convert to Catholicism. In ultra-Protestant Sweden, that was political suicide. But she didn't care. She wanted art. She wanted music. She wanted Rome. Upon arrival in Italy, she caused a sensation. The papacy welcomed her like a prodigal daughter. She marched into St. Peter's Basilica, publicly converted, and told the world she was done pretending to be someone she wasn't. The Vatican was delighted. They'd never had a real-life queen just fall into their lap before. They gave her a palace. She turned it into a chaotic salon full of musicians, painters, exiled nobles, and suspiciously attractive young men. Christina spent the rest of her life causing polite chaos across Europe. She got involved in papal elections. She dabbled in espionage. She tried to become Queen of Naples. She launched a failed invasion of Corsica. She threatened to duel critics. She made enemies and fans everywhere she went. Voltaire called her a woman without a kingdom who caused more trouble than most kings. And still, she moved through the world like she had nothing to lose and everything to discuss over wine and death. She got the last word. She insisted on being buried in St. Peter's Basilica, the only woman ever laid to rest there. Not a saint, not a martyr, just Christina. The queen who chose freedom over power, intellect over obedience, and herself over everyone else's expectations, so raise a glass to Christina of Sweden, the dropout queen, the swaggering philosopher, the woman who ruled a nation then walked away to rule her own story. Tsar Peter III of Russia, the emperor who played with toy soldiers while his wife planned a coup if monarchy were a board game. Tsar Peter III of Russia would be the guy who rolled a 6 and still managed to walk off the board, trip over a rook, and accidentally hand the crown to his wife, who, by the way, had already planned checkmate 10 moves ago. This is the man who inherited the Russian Empire, held on to it for exactly 6 months, and somehow fumbled the bag so hard that his own wife said, "You know what? I'll do it myself," and then did. Peter III didn't lose the empire because he was evil or tyrannical or even unlucky. He lost it because he was a giant nerd with a toy soldier addiction, a Prussia fetish, and the political instincts of a boiled beet. Peter was born in 1728 in the German duchy of Holstein-Gottorp, which already sounds like the setting of a Monty Python sketch. He was the grandson of Peter the Great, which is like being Michael Jordan's nephew when you can't even dribble. His parents died young, and he was dragged to Russia at age 14 to become heir to the imperial throne, despite not speaking Russian, not knowing Russian customs, and honestly not caring. He hated Russia. He hated vodka. He hated the Orthodox Church. But most of all, he hated not being Frederick the Great. Peter was obsessed with Prussia, the German kingdom run by military genius and fashion-forward tyrant Frederick the Great. He wore Prussian uniforms. He copied Prussian marching styles. He talked about Prussia so much that his courtiers probably started praying for Prussia to just adopt him and be done with it. This obsession would become his downfall. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, and 1745. Peter was married off to a 16-year-old German princess named Sophia, who would later take the name Catherine. Yes, that Catherine, as in Catherine the Great. At the time, she was smart, ambitious, and very aware that her new husband was not the sharpest bayonet in the armory. Their marriage was a train wreck in slow motion. Peter was childish, immature, and spent most nights playing with toy soldiers in bed instead of doing what royal couples were expected to do. Namely, produce heirs and occasionally tolerate each other. He even forced Catherine to watch him conduct fake battles between his mini tin army, complete with trumpet noises and sound effects. Catherine, to her eternal credit, did not strangle him with a bedsheet on the spot. Peter, meanwhile, wrote love letters to his dog. Yes, you read that correctly. He also held mock military trials for his toys and once executed a rat by hanging it from a tiny gallows for desertion. Let that visual marinate for a moment. This was the heir to one of the largest empires in the world, and he was prosecuting rodents for treason. Fast forward to 1762. Peter becomes Tsar after the death of Empress Elizabeth. You'd think he'd take this as a cue to act serious. Instead, he doubles down on Prussia cosplay. He immediately pulls Russia out of the 7 Years' War, despite them being on the brink of victory, and signs a treaty giving land back to Frederick the Great. Russian generals were furious. The public was confused. Frederick, however, was thrilled and probably sent Peter a thank you fruit basket and a personalized autograph. Peter then passed a series of reforms so bafflingly tone-deaf it's like he was speedrunning how to lose an empire. He removed restrictions on the nobility, upset the clergy by seizing church land, and alienated the army by replacing traditional Russian uniforms with Prussian ones. Because nothing says national unity like making your military dress like the enemy. His approval rating plummeted faster than a cannonball off a Kremlin balcony. Meanwhile, back at the palace, Catherine had been doing her homework. She'd been studying Russian, befriending nobles, flattering generals, and, most importantly, building alliances. She knew Peter wasn't just unpopular. He was ripe for removal. And when Peter, in his infinite wisdom, threatened to disinherit her and marry his mistress, Catherine decided it was time to go full Empress mode in July 1762. While Peter was off playing royal dress-up at his estate in Oranienbaum, Catherine made her move. At dawn, she rode into St. Petersburg in full military uniform, flanked by soldiers who had defected to her side. She was calm, collected, and absolutely done with her husband's nonsense. Within hours, she was declared empress by the imperial guard. The church blessed her. The army supported her. The people cheered. It was the cleanest coup in Russian history. Peter, upon hearing the news, panicked like a squirrel during thunder. He tried to flee, then tried to negotiate, then asked if they could just share the empire. Catherine's response was a diplomatic version of "boy, bye." Peter was arrested, imprisoned, and a few days later mysteriously died. Official reports claimed hemorrhoidal colic, which is 18th century code for "we're not going to talk about it." Most historians agree he was assassinated by Catherine's supporters. She never publicly addressed his death, just moved forward, ruling for 34 years as one of the greatest monarchs in Russian history. Peter III, on the other hand, became a historical footnote. A bizarre, tragicomic figure remembered less for anything he did and more for how spectacularly he didn't do anything right. He had power and gave it away. He had a throne and lost it to someone who understood it better than he ever could. And all because, in the end, he loved fake battles more than real politics. His legacy? Toy soldiers, a dead rat, and a wife who became legendary by overthrowing him before breakfast. Emperor Elagabalus, the teen emperor who married a priest, bathed in perfume, and declared a rock his god. If you think the Roman Empire was all marble statues and serious men in togas debating the Republic, allow me to introduce Emperor Elagabalus, the teenage glitter bomb that exploded all over Rome's dignity. Imagine if RuPaul, Caligula, and a confused cult leader had a love child and handed him an empire at age 14. That's Elagabalus. He didn't just break the rules, he poured perfume on them, married a man in public, sacrificed bulls to a black meteorite, and then asked Rome why it was so obsessed with being boring. If Peter III played with toy soldiers, Elagabalus played with the entire empire like it was a backstage fashion show. And Rome never recovered from the rhinestone-studded whiplash. Born in 203 AD in Syria, his real name was Varius Avitus Bassianus, but don't worry, he changed it 6 times before the Senate could even memorize the first one. He came from a powerful priestly family and served as high priest of the sun god Elagabal in Emesa, modern-day Homs, a role that involved worshipping a sacred black stone believed to be a meteorite. The boy loved that rock. He dressed it, paraded it, sang to it, and later forced the Roman Empire to worship it too. You think modern politicians are weird? Try being ruled by a teen who introduced his god rock as Rome's new supreme deity. Elagabalus only got the throne because of family scheming on steroids. His grandmother, Julia Misa, think Game of Thrones with better eyeliner, was a sister of a former empress. After Emperor Caracalla's death, she spread rumors that Elagabalus was Caracalla's illegitimate son. Spoiler, he wasn't, gathered an army, and declared, "This boy is your emperor now." The Roman legions shrugged, muttered, "Sure." And suddenly a 14-year-old son priest became the most powerful man in the known world. Now, you'd expect a teenage emperor to party a little, maybe throw some wild feasts. Elagabalus said, "Hold my wine." He took one look at Roman tradition and twerked on its ashes. He wore silk robes instead of military gear. He dyed his hair, wore makeup and jewels, and was obsessed with beauty, decadence, and pushing boundaries. When Rome expected a Caesar, it got a cross-dressing priest who danced in public and rode around in chariots pulled by naked women. This was not a phase. This was his imperial policy. Religion? Oh, he had plans. Elagabalus dragged his god, the sacred black meteorite, from Syria to Rome and declared Elagabal the chief deity of the Roman pantheon. Jupiter? Retired. Mars? Cancelled. He built a massive temple, the Elagabalium, on the Palatine Hill and forced Roman senators to watch sacrifices that were less solemn rite and more blood-soaked EDM concert. Bulls, goats, doves, you name it, he slaughtered it, all in the name of his holy space rock. But it wasn't just religious chaos. Elagabalus also treated gender and sexuality like an open buffet. He was married 5 times, 3 of them to women, but one of the most famous was to a male charioteer named Hierocles. He called Hierocles his husband. He gave him titles. He kissed him in public. He made Hierocles wear purple, the color of emperors. When senators complained, Elagabalus laughed and appointed his next boyfriend to the imperial guard. He openly sought sex reassignment surgery, begged doctors to find a way to make him female, and allegedly referred to himself as the wife, the mistress, and the queen of his male lovers. In 3rd century Rome, let that sink in. This isn't modern revisionism. These are ancient Roman historians who, though biased and scandalized, recorded these events with wide-eyed horror and scribbling hands. And then there were the parties. Elagabalus held orgies that made Caligula look like a monk. He filled banquet halls with roses so deep guests nearly suffocated. He served fake food just to watch guests starve. He released wild animals during dinner to see who panicked. He had silver toilets and golden chamber pots. He once invited 8 bald men, 8 blind men, and 8 deaf men to a feast just for symmetry. His idea of fun? Watching naked dancers perform on tables while leopards wandered the room. No one knew if they were at a dinner party or an ancient fever dream. Meanwhile, the empire was crumbling. Roman elites were furious. The military was embarrassed. The people were confused. And his own grandmother, yes, the one who gave him the throne, was now plotting his removal. Why? Because he made his cousin, Alexander Severus, a sweet, respectable boy, look like a better option. The Senate agreed. The army agreed. Even the palace guards were like, honestly, we can't anymore. In 222 AD, after just 4 years of imperial glitter and goat blood, Elagabalus was assassinated. He was 18. Accounts say the Praetorian Guard stormed the palace, butchered him and his mother, and threw their bodies into the Tiber River. The temple of Elagabal was torn down. His name was stricken from inscriptions. His reign was officially declared a disgrace. But Rome couldn't erase the memory. Not entirely. Because for 4 years, a teenager made of sequins and chaos had dared to be too much for an empire built on tradition and testosterone. Historians argue whether Elagabalus was a monster, a martyr, or a misunderstood queer icon. Maybe he was all 3. What's undeniable is that he shattered every Roman expectation of masculinity, piety, and order. He treated identity as performance, power as theater, and Rome itself as a stage, and then danced across it until the curtain fell. So the next time someone tells you history is boring, tell them about the teen emperor who married a man, declared a meteorite the king of gods, and held dinner parties that turned into wildlife documentaries. Emperor Nero, the pyromaniac who fiddled while Rome burned and turned his palace into a pleasure dome. When Rome burned, Emperor Nero didn't grab a bucket. He allegedly grabbed a fiddle. Whether he actually played music as flames swallowed the eternal city is still debated. But honestly, does it even matter? This is the same emperor who thought murder was foreplay, theater was government, and architecture should reflect his divine glory, preferably in gold leaf and flamingo feathers. Nero wasn't just a bad emperor. He was the main character of his own opera, written, directed, and starred in by himself. And when the curtains closed on Rome, Nero was backstage setting the props on fire and shouting, "Encore!" Born in 37 AD, Nero was adopted by his great-uncle, Emperor Claudius, after his scheming mother, Agrippina the Younger, basically staged an imperial version of The Bachelor. She poisoned her enemies, married her uncle, and manipulated the Senate like it was a chessboard soaked in ambition. Her prize? Putting her son on the throne. At age 17, Nero became Emperor of Rome. First, things were calm. He listened to his tutors, including the philosopher Seneca, passed some decent reforms, and even reduced taxes. For 5 years, Rome thought, hey, maybe this won't be a disaster. Then puberty hit his ego like a javelin to the face. Nero decided he was not just emperor, he was an artist, a god, a poet, a charioteer, a musician. He wore silk robes, styled his hair like a diva, and recited his own poetry to captive audiences who legally could not leave the room. He made senators sit through hours of lyre concerts, pretending to be moved by performances that would make a cat yowl in protest. Applause wasn't optional. One man faked his death just to escape a recital. But Nero wasn't content with artistic tyranny. He also dove headfirst into murder. First on the list, his mother. Agrippina had raised him, manipulated him, and then dared to criticize his love affairs. Nero responded like any emotionally stable son. He tried to sink her boat. When she swam ashore like the indestructible horror mother she was, he simply sent soldiers to stab her in bed. She allegedly told them to stab the womb that bore him. Poetic if true, messy if not. Next came his wives, plural. First Octavia, whom he exiled and later executed for not being interesting enough. Then Poppaea Sabina, whom he loved so much that he kicked her to death while she was pregnant. Third wife Statilia Messalina only survived because she kept her head down and her opinions to herself, which in Nero's Rome was basically an Olympic sport. Then, in 64 AD, the fire started. It raged for 6 days, destroying 2/3 of the city. Temples collapsed. Markets turned to ash. Families died in their homes. And what did Nero do? According to legend, he stood on his balcony in theatrical robes, playing a lyre and singing of Troy's destruction. Whether he lit the match himself or not, one thing is certain. He used the disaster as a design opportunity. With most of the city gone, Nero saw his chance to build the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, the most opulent palace in Roman history. It wasn't just a house. It was an imperial fever dream. It had fountains that flowed with perfume, a rotating ceiling that mimicked the heavens, and a 120-foot statue of himself dressed as the sun god. The dining rooms had ceilings that rained down rose petals and glitter. Guests dined beneath frescoes of gods, who suspiciously looked like Nero. It was less home and more Vegas hotel designed by a narcissist with a god complex. But Nero's Rome wasn't just a city of excess. It was a stage. He entered public singing contests where no one else was allowed to win. He raced chariots dressed like a Greek hero, while real athletes pretended to fall behind. He even went on tour in Greece, forcing local cities to shut down so he could perform for them. Every festival became a Nero fest. Every crown went to him. If Instagram had existed, his feed would have been solid gold lyres, over-filtered torch selfies, and captions like "Fire Emperor by day, Muse by night." #divine talent, #Rome is my stage. Meanwhile, the empire was rotting. Revolts broke out in Britain, Judea, and Gaul. The army lost confidence. The Senate whispered treason. Nero, in response, built more fountains. He executed rivals. He raised taxes to fund more artistic projects. And when that wasn't enough, he declared himself a living god. The final straw came when governors began declaring loyalty to someone else. Galba, an old general with an army and absolutely no patience for musical emperors in 68 AD, with rebellion surging and the Senate turning on him, Nero panicked. He fled the city with a few loyal slaves, wandering the countryside in disguise. For the first time in his life, no one clapped. When soldiers closed in, Nero asked one servant to dig his grave, then stabbed himself in the throat. His final words? "What an artist dies in me." Rome didn't mourn. The Senate declared him enemy of the people. His name was scrubbed from monuments. The Domus Aurea was looted. Statues toppled. Nero had ruled for 14 years and burned through every ounce of goodwill like it was lamp oil. But even in disgrace, his legend lived on. Christians said he was the Antichrist. Some Romans claimed he wasn't dead at all, just waiting in the East to return. Even centuries later, the phrase Nero redivivus, Nero reborn, haunted paranoid emperors like a bad musical note. So was Nero a monster? A misunderstood diva? A victim of bad press? Maybe all three. But more than anything, he was the emperor who made Rome into a cabaret, then danced into oblivion wearing a golden toga and eyeliner. When the city burned, he didn't rebuild it for the people. He rebuilt it for himself with better acoustics. King Charles II of England, the party king who turned the court into a nightclub and fathered half the aristocracy. When the English Civil War ended, the Puritans had drained the joy out of England like someone pulled the plug on a fountain of wine. No dancing, no theater, no gambling, no fun. Just sermons, self-flagellation, and enough black fabric to smother a generation. Enter King Charles II, the original comeback king who restored the monarchy, revived the party, and single-handedly turned the English court into a 17th-century version of Ibiza with powdered wigs. If his father died for a crown, Charles was going to wear it with a feathered hat and a mistress on each arm. Born in 1630, Charles spent his youth in exile during the rise of Oliver Cromwell's Puritan dictatorship. While England drowned in piety, Charles was in France, Spain, and the Netherlands, learning how to charm, flirt, drink, gamble, and occasionally pretend to do politics. By the time Cromwell died in 1658 and the English realized they'd rather have a monarch than live in a sermon, Charles returned in a wave of national relief. Crowds cheered. Bells rang. England, exhausted by righteousness, welcomed sin back with open arms, and Charles did not disappoint. His coronation in 1660 marked the official start of the Restoration. But for Charles, it might as well have been called the grand opening of Charles II's Pleasure Palace. He reopened the theaters Cromwell had closed and filled them with drama, comedy, scandal, and actresses, a novelty, since women weren't allowed on stage before. His court was a living play, full of poetry, sex, intrigue, and more gossip than an aristocratic group chat. Charles wasn't just king. He was tall, dark, and scandalously handsome. He had long black curls, smoldering eyes, and a reputation that made noblewomen faint and courtiers panic. He spoke French, danced like a dream, and could flatter a duchess while negotiating with Parliament. In short, he was the hottest king England ever had, and he knew it. Charles had at least 13 acknowledged mistresses. The unofficial count is many more, ranging from noblewomen to actresses to the occasional married lady with a scandalous glint. He wasn't discreet, nor did he try to be. His most famous mistress, Nell Gwynn, was a former orange seller turned actress with a filthy mouth and a golden heart. When an angry crowd once mistook her for a Catholic and jeered, she leaned out the carriage window and shouted, "I'm the Protestant whore." England loved her for it. Charles fathered at least 12 illegitimate children, which he acknowledged, titled, and sometimes threw into the peerage like they were party favors. One became the Duke of Monmouth. Others became dukes, earls, and royal punchlines. He didn't produce a legitimate heir with his wife, Queen Catherine of Braganza, but that's only because she had the misfortune of not being his type. Catholic, infertile, and monogamous. Still, Charles didn't hate her. In fact, he was unusually kind to his queen, even if he cheated with such spectacular commitment that the royal bed was more symbolic than functional. He made sure she had dignity, respect, and no shortage of silks. He just refused to stop partying. And oh, the parties! Charles threw masquerades, midnight banquets, and fountains of wine. The court glittered with satins, powdered wigs, and drunken poetry. His inner circle included scientists, writers, libertines, and rogues. It was during his reign that the Royal Society was founded. Yes, between affairs, Charles also funded Isaac Newton. Multitasking king behavior. But not everything was candles and corsets. His reign was also a catastrophe buffet that would have crushed a less charming man. First came the Great Plague of 1665, which turned London into a graveyard. Then the Great Fire of 1666 burned down most of the city. While the flames roared through the capital, Charles was on the streets, in person, helping organize fire lines and coordinate response. His popularity surged because nothing's sexier than a monarch with soot on his face and a bucket in his hand. Then came religious chaos. Charles was outwardly Protestant-ish, but sympathetic to Catholics, especially since his brother James was a full-on papist waiting in the wings. Parliament, terrified of a Catholic dynasty, passed the Test Act excluding Catholics from power. Charles signed it with one hand and continued tolerating Catholic advisors with the other. When asked about religion, he famously said, "I am of the religion of all those who are brave and true." Translation: "Don't ask me, I'm hungover." Politically, Charles danced a dangerous waltz. He flirted with absolutism but kept Parliament close enough to avoid French-style beheading. He took secret subsidies from Louis XIV of France, effectively being paid to not fight. And yet, he kept England relatively stable for a man whose daily schedule included gambling, hunting, mistress hopping, and a 2-hour wig fitting. His critics called him lazy, immoral, and too French. His fans called him witty, tolerant, and the fun parent of the monarchy. Charles didn't care. He ruled with a smirk, governed with flair, and seduced history into forgiving him. When he died in 1685, his last words were reportedly, "Let not poor Nelly starve," because even in death he thought of his mistress. He also told the gathered physicians, "I'm sorry, gentlemen, for being such a long time dying." Peak Charles. Always courteous, always cheeky, even while exiting stage left. Charles II left no legitimate heir, so the crown passed to his brother James, whose Catholicism triggered a full-blown crisis. But that's another royal mess. What Charles left behind was a new vision of kingship. Sensual, stylish, smart enough to survive, and unapologetically indulgent. He didn't rebuild the monarchy with fear or absolutism. He rebuilt it with charm, wit, sex appeal, and an unrelenting desire to make England fun again. He was scandalous but beloved, reckless but clever, and the walking, laughing proof that sometimes the heart of a nation beats loudest at the after-party. King Philip IV of France. The handsome king who burned the Templars and still managed to get cursed into a dynasty collapse. If you've ever wondered what happens when you combine royal paranoia, religious hypocrisy, fiscal desperation, and a face sculpted by the medieval gods of jawlines, meet Philip IV of France, aka Philip the Fair. He was so attractive that people literally called him fair. But don't let the cheekbones fool you. Behind those icy eyes was a control freak in a crown who managed to bankrupt his kingdom, wage war on the Pope, obliterate the most powerful knightly order in Europe, and possibly get himself cursed into a full-on royal extinction event. Born in 1268, Philip ascended to the French throne in 1285. He was a Capricorn with resting execution face, and from day one, he ruled like a tax accountant with a personal grudge against everyone richer than him. The kingdom's coffers were dry, and Philip had expensive ambitions, wars to fight, castles to decorate, and wigs for the horses or whatever nobles spent money on in the 13th century. So he did what any financially desperate monarch would do. He looked around and asked, "Who can I squeeze for gold without getting stabbed?" First, he turned to the Jews. He taxed them into oblivion, confiscated their property, and then expelled them from France. "Thanks for your contribution, now get out." Then he tried the Lombards, Italian bankers, pulling the same shakedown because if you were rich and foreign, Philip considered you a piggy bank with legs. Next came the Catholic Church itself. Yes, Philip the Fair thought it was a good idea to go to war with the Pope. Now, medieval popes were not known for humility, but Pope Boniface VIII was in a league of his own. When Philip tried to tax the clergy, Boniface said absolutely not, and reminded the king that he was merely God's intern. Philip responded with royal middle fingers and propaganda campaigns, calling the Pope a criminal and accusing him of witchcraft, heresy, and being Italian, which, in Philip's mind, was 3 separate crimes. When words didn't work, Philip sent soldiers to Italy to beat Boniface into a coma. The Pope died shortly after, probably of rage, and Philip replaced him with someone more pliable and French. But Philip's most iconic historical move, the one that earned him a place on every cursed history list ever, was the destruction of the Knights Templar. The Templars were the medieval equivalent of a multinational military banking religious corporation wrapped in armor and dipped in incense. Originally founded to protect Christian pilgrims, the Templars became filthy rich, like owning land in every European kingdom and inventing credit cards rich. They were powerful, untouchable, and, crucially for Philip, deep in assets. By 1307. Philip owed the Templars a mountain of debt and didn't feel like paying it back. So he did what any responsible monarch would do. He accused them of Satan worship. Seriously, on Friday the 13th, October 1307, Philip coordinated the mass arrest of every Templar in France. The charges: spitting on the cross, kissing each other's butts during initiation, worshipping a mysterious idol called Baphomet, and, wait for it, cooking babies in cauldrons. No one really believed the accusations, but under medieval torture, people will confess to eating the moon if you twist hard enough. Dozens of Templars were burned at the stake, their lands seized, their leadership imprisoned. The Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, endured 7 years of imprisonment and finally faced public execution in 1314. As the flames licked his feet, de Molay allegedly shouted a curse. Pope Clement and King Philip, within the year, I summon you before the judgment of God. Both men died within months. Coincidence? Maybe. But the curse didn't stop there. Within 14 years of that bonfire, all 3 of Philip's sons who inherited the throne died without male heirs. One by one, the Capetian dynasty collapsed like a royal game of Jenga, ushering in the 100 Years' War, a succession crisis, and a century of misery. All because one man wanted to erase his debt by torching some monks with swords. And here's the kicker: Philip never saw any of this coming. While alive, he genuinely thought he was a righteous king. He reformed the legal system, centralized power, and thought burning bankers was just effective fiscal management. He saw himself as God's hammer, punishing corruption, enforcing justice, and, well, extorting everyone not named Philip. He was not warm, not witty, and certainly not fun at parties. But he looked like a king, tall, stern, with piercing eyes and a face that belonged on a cathedral fresco. He wore long flowing robes and walked around looking like the final boss of Gothic drama. Diplomats feared him. Nobles obeyed him. The Pope hid from him. But even stone-faced kings can't dodge karma forever. Philip IV died in 1314 after falling from his horse during a hunting trip, because the gods of irony never miss a beat. He left behind a broken dynasty, a haunted legacy, and enough supernatural suspicion to inspire centuries of Templar conspiracy theories, from Freemasons to Da Vinci Code fanfics. So if you're wondering where the phrase Friday the 13th is unlucky comes from, now you know. It started with a handsome French king arresting 15,000 battle monks on a whim. Because in medieval history, hot doesn't mean harmless. And sometimes the prettiest king in the room turns out to be the one who burns the house down with holy fire. Emperor Justinian II, the Byzantine ruler who lost his nose, came back with a gold one, and then lost his head. If you thought Game of Thrones had too many betrayals, surprise comebacks, and gruesome facial trauma, wait until you meet Justinian II Rhinopmetos, the Byzantine emperor who turned imperial humiliation into the world's pettiest and bloodiest comeback tour. This man was deposed, mutilated, exiled, and left for dead, and then, like some glittering Byzantine zombie, came back wearing a prosthetic nose made of gold and burned everyone who crossed him. His reign was not a fairy tale. It was a revenge opera sung in Greek, screamed in Latin, and written entirely in blood. born around 668 AD. Justinian too was the son of Emperor Constantine IV and, unfortunately for him, inherited the throne young and full of spicy delusion. At just 16, he became emperor in 685, and he hit the Byzantine Empire like a caffeinated peacock, full of grand ideas, big reforms, and no social awareness whatsoever. He tried to centralize imperial power, reform tax systems, and reorganize the army. Good, right? Well, yes. Except he did it all with the subtlety of a flaming sword. Justinian's first reign was marked by overreach, arrogance, and extremely poor people skills. He raised taxes so aggressively that peasants fled the empire. He signed weird treaties with the Arabs, poked at Slavic tribes, and forced religious leaders to obey imperial mandates like they were foot soldiers. His idea of diplomacy was, do what I say, or I'll send the army. Unsurprisingly, this made him unpopular with literally everyone except himself. BY 695. The people of Constantinople had had enough of his autocratic nonsense and rose up in revolt. They dragged him from the palace, cut off his nose, because in Byzantine law a mutilated emperor couldn't rule, yes, that was a real thing, and sent him into exile in the city of Kherson near modern-day Crimea. You'd think that would be the end of it. You'd be wrong. Because Justinian didn't die. He didn't surrender. He built a new life, married a princess, and plotted revenge so intense it could curdle goat milk. While in exile, Justinian connected with Tervel, Khan of the Bulgars, who apparently looked at the noseless emperor and said, "You had me at vengeance." With a Bulgarian army and the world's first recorded golden nose prosthetic glued to his face like a Bond villain, Justinian marched back to Constantinople in 705. He didn't sneak in. He stormed the gates, scaled the walls at night, and reclaimed the throne like a Goth gladiator on a vendetta-fueled mission. The people of Constantinople awoke to find their mutilated, very angry ex-emperor back on the throne, and he was not in a forgiving mood. Let's talk about Justinian's revenge phase. He rounded up everyone who had participated in his overthrow. Nobles, generals, former friends, monks, probably his old tailor, and executed them. The man who had taken his place, Leontios, was dragged through the hippodrome, publicly humiliated, and then beheaded. Another usurper, Tiberios, suffered the same fate. Anyone who had even looked at him sideways in exile was now headless. His comeback wasn't just political, it was personal. And it didn't stop there. Justinian ruled with a rage-fueled paranoia so severe that he purged allies, killed advisors, and burned cities that didn't cheer loudly enough. He forced families to pay back decades-old debts. He executed entire communities on suspicion of treason. It was like he had a medieval burn book and was working his way through it line by line. Even his allies started getting nervous. Khan Tervel, who had helped him regain the throne, expected gratitude or at least a nice fruit basket. Instead, Justinian tried to assassinate him. The attempt failed, and the Bulgars responded by raiding Byzantine territory and burning half of Thrace. Because if there's one thing Justinian excelled at besides resurrection, it was making enemies out of literally everyone. By 711. The empire was crumbling under his paranoia and comically bad diplomacy. Another rebellion started, this time in Kherson. Yes, the same city that once exiled him. Like déjà vu with extra violence. The rebels joined forces with the Khazars and advanced toward Constantinople. Justinian tried to flee with his family, but he was captured while trying to escape by boat. And just like that, the comeback king lost the plot that he was executed, decapitated, his golden nose likely tossed in a drawer somewhere, and his head paraded on a spike as a warning to future tyrants with prosthetic ambitions. His son was also murdered, putting a bloody period on a dynasty that had burned hot, fast, and absolutely insane. But Justinian's legacy isn't just the bloodbath of his revenge reign. It's the fact that he came back at all. He was the only Byzantine emperor to be overthrown, mutilated, exiled, and then reclaim his throne through sheer willpower, spite, and a nose made of solid bling. Historians often portray him as unstable, cruel, and utterly obsessed with power. And they're right. But they also have to admit, no one, absolutely no one, made an entrance like Justinian II. He turned failure into a comeback, exile into a warpath, and disfigurement into gold-plated fashion. His life reads like a medieval rock ballad written by someone on fire and drinking venom, and it reminds us that in Byzantine politics, death isn't always the end. Sometimes it's just the intermission before your villain arc. Emperor Commodus, the gladiator emperor who thought he was Hercules and tried to rebrand Rome as his own theme park. If you've ever watched Gladiator and thought, there's no way an emperor could be that unhinged, let me introduce you to Emperor Commodus, the Roman ruler who believed he was Hercules, fought in the Colosseum against wild animals, renamed Rome after himself, and basically treated the empire like his own personal cosplay arena. He wasn't just mad with power. He was mad with glitter, muscle oil, and the need to be cheered for swinging a wooden sword. Born in 161 AD, Commodus was the golden boy of Marcus Aurelius, one of the wisest and most stoic emperors in Roman history. While Marcus was off writing meditations and trying to keep the empire from collapsing, little Commodus was busy yelling at slaves and flexing in bronze mirrors. He became co-emperor at the age of 15 and solo emperor by 19, which is just asking for disaster. Giving absolute power to a teenage jock with a god complex is like handing your kingdom to a shirtless Instagram influencer and hoping for the best. Commodus didn't want to govern. He wanted to be adored. While previous emperors focused on administration, military campaigns, and taxes, Commodus focused on greasing himself up and posing like a demigod. He declared that he was the reincarnation of Hercules, complete with lion-skin cape, wooden club, and no sense of irony. He had statues made of himself dressed like Hercules and forced the Senate to recognize him as a living god. He renamed all 12 months of the calendar after his own imperial names. Yes, January? Gone. Now it's Commodus. February? Still Commodus. March? Surprise, it's also Commodus. He even renamed Rome itself Colonia Commodiana. Because why should the Eternal City be named after some old myth when it could be a full-blown tribute to the emperor's delusional ego? And then there were the games. Commodus was obsessed with gladiator combat. But he didn't just watch the fights, he joined them. Over 700 times. The emperor of Rome would strut into the Colosseum in golden armor, carrying a wooden sword, so his opponents couldn't accidentally kill him, and stage fights against maimed, starved, or otherwise helpless adversaries. Slaves, amputees, and even wild animals were brought in for him to slaughter, often tied up or half dead before the fight began. One time, he killed a giraffe just to confuse the audience. Another time, he charged into the arena to slaughter hundreds of animals in one day, while the crowd politely tried not to vomit from the smell. He made senators pay to attend these spectacles. Some had to cheer or face exile. Others wept silently into their togas while Commodus pranced around in a lion headdress, yelling, "I am the savior of Rome." He didn't just want to be emperor. He wanted to be the main character in a living mythology, with himself as every god, every hero, and every victor. But when Commodus wasn't butchering wildlife or threatening to kill anyone who didn't applaud his sword twirls, he was alienating literally everyone trying to keep the empire functional. He delegated power to a series of corrupt favorites and let the actual administration rot while he focused on training for the next match. Rome didn't have a leader. It had a muscle-bound maniac in leather sandals pretending to be a god while the provinces caught fire. His favorite sycophant was a former slave named Cleander, who sold government offices to the highest bidder. Want to be governor? Pay up. Want to be consul? Cleander's got a price. Eventually, this blatant auction of power led to a food shortage in Rome. The mob rioted, Cleander was lynched in the streets, and Commodus responded by fighting more in the arena. Nothing says leadership like dodging political chaos with a staged tiger fight. Why now? The Senate hated him. The army didn't trust him. The people feared him. But Commodus didn't care, because in his own sweaty, megalomaniacal mind, he was invincible. In 192 AD, he announced he would appear in public dressed as Hercules to celebrate the new year, followed by gladiatorial games in which he, the emperor, would fight as a god while Rome looked on in forced awe. This was the final straw. His inner circle, fed-up senators, military officials, and even his own mistress, decided he had to go. His concubine Marcia poisoned his wine, and when that didn't work quickly enough, his wrestling partner Narcissus was sent in to strangle him in the bath. Yes, the man who thought he was Hercules died at the hands of his personal trainer. Poetic, tragic, and honestly very on brand. After Commodus was dead, the Senate declared him a public enemy, erased his name from monuments, and burned every statue they could find, which was a lot. This man commissioned dozens of himself in lion-skin drag. Rome immediately tried to forget the human fever dream who turned the empire into a one-man talent show and nearly wrecked 200 years of imperial dignity in a single glitter-soaked reign. And yet, he's unforgettable. Commodus was not the worst emperor by cruelty or destruction, that honor belongs to others, but he may well have been the most absurd. He took vanity to divine levels, treated real power like stage props, and forced one of the greatest civilizations in human history to become his personal theater. His rule is a cautionary tale of what happens when unchecked narcissism, inherited privilege, and a total lack of self-awareness are handed the keys to an empire. So next time you see someone flexing for applause with no idea what they're doing, remember Commodus, the man who dressed like a god, renamed Rome, and died with more statues of himself than friends. King Wenceslas IV of Bohemia, the lazy king who drank, fished, and let his kingdom burn while he napped in a bathrobe. There are rulers who conquer, rulers who legislate, rulers who inspire. And then there's Wenceslas IV of Bohemia, the medieval monarch who ruled a kingdom like it was a backyard hammock, spent most of his time drunk or fishing, and whose greatest act of leadership was managing to avoid doing anything useful until his people literally begged him to stop existing. If there was ever a medieval king who qualified for a gold medal in historical loafing, this was the guy. Born in 1361, Wenceslas was the son of Charles IV, Holy Roman Emperor and one of the most competent rulers in European history. Charles built universities, forged alliances, and elevated Bohemia to its golden age. Unfortunately, his heir inherited none of that. Instead, Wenceslas emerged into adulthood as an unmotivated, belligerent, wine-guzzling disappointment with a deep love for falconry and an even deeper hatred for paperwork. Crowned king of Bohemia at 2 and king of the Romans, which basically meant he was the next Holy Roman Emperor. At 15, Wenceslaus began his rule by doing nothing, and then somehow managed to do even less with each passing year. He avoided state duties like they were contagious diseases. While other monarchs were hosting councils or quelling rebellions, Wenceslaus was curled up in a velvet robe, sipping mead, tossing fish to his pet birds, and muttering about how exhausting politics was. His court became a frat house of boozy nobility, half-baked policies, and random executions. Wenceslaus surrounded himself with unqualified drinking buddies instead of advisors. If someone annoyed him, a bishop, a noble, a member of parliament, he'd have them arrested, tortured, or casually drowned in a barrel. It was monarchy by mood swing, and the kingdom paid the price. Meanwhile, Bohemia, a kingdom known for culture, scholarship, and strong governance, descended into chaos. Local lords began ignoring royal authority. Peasants revolted over tax burdens Wenceslaus didn't even realize he'd imposed. And neighboring kingdoms started eyeing Bohemia like it was a free buffet. But Wenceslaus was unbothered. He'd rather talk to his falcons. When the Holy Roman Empire needed leadership, Wenceslaus didn't show up. When his German princes requested reforms, Wenceslaus ignored their letters. When the Pope called a council, Wenceslaus forgot he was invited. Eventually, the electors of the empire, fed up with his perpetual absenteeism and smell of ale, voted to depose him in 1400. Wenceslaus responded by locking himself in his hunting lodge and pretending he hadn't heard. Yes, the king of the Romans was technically fired, but he refused to leave the job. It was the medieval equivalent of getting sacked but refusing to hand over your office keycard. For the next 2 decades, he insisted he was still emperor while doing nothing remotely emperor-like. Back in Bohemia, things got worse. Wenceslaus alienated the Catholic Church by refusing to support their pope during the Great Schism. He angered the nobility by confiscating lands on a whim. He infuriated reformers by refusing to protect scholars like Jan Hus, a popular preacher who wanted to clean up the church. And when violence broke out between pro-reform peasants and royalist mercenaries, Wenceslaus did the only thing he knew how to do: disappear into the forest with a bottle and a bucket of bait. By now, his brother Sigismund, an ambitious and power-hungry political shark, saw the writing on the wall. Sigismund began plotting to replace Wenceslaus and assumed the role of responsible adult, while his older brother hid in castles and napped through rebellion. The citizens of Prague rioted. The nobility mutinied. The church placed the city under interdict. Still, Wenceslaus refused to act. Why? Because he genuinely believed he was doing fine. When courtiers asked him about the latest uprising, he'd shrug and say, "They'll calm down." When told the economy was collapsing, he'd roll over in bed and mumble something about trusting the natural order. The man ruled like gravity would solve things for him. In 1410, he had a complete breakdown, possibly a stroke or a psychotic episode, and spent weeks screaming in his palace about being betrayed by birds. Historians aren't sure if this was paranoia, a hallucination, or just really bad wine. Afterward, he became even more withdrawn, letting Bohemia govern itself while he wandered the countryside with dogs and servants, writing down fishing advice. That's not a metaphor. He literally published notes on fish behavior. His final years were a haze of sulking, hunting, bathing, and lecturing servants on how to properly boil eels. By 1419, Bohemia was on the verge of civil war. Jan Hus had been burned at the stake, sparking the Hussite movement, and the people were demanding a leader who didn't sleep through every apocalypse. Wenceslas responded by dying. He collapsed in his palace, likely from heart failure, though many suspected poison, depression, or sheer royal indifference, and Bohemia immediately exploded. The Hussite Wars broke out within months. Religious radicals stormed Prague. Nobles formed militias. Sigismund marched in with troops. The kingdom Wenceslas left behind was a smoldering mess of ideological rage, institutional collapse, and absolutely no fish. And yet, he wasn't evil. That's the tragic twist. Wenceslas wasn't a monster, just fundamentally uninterested in power. He liked animals more than humans, relaxation more than ruling, and had no talent for decision-making. He was a royal hermit in a gold robe, more comfortable whispering to trout than speaking to nobles. He should have been a forest poet or a beekeeper. Instead, he became king, and Bohemia paid the price. Today, he's remembered as the king who slept through history. The ruler who didn't fight wars, didn't build monuments, didn't legislate laws. He just drank, wandered, sulked, and let his kingdom implode around him. In a way, he's a cautionary tale for anyone who thinks avoiding responsibility will keep the peace. It won't. Sometimes indifference is more destructive than cruelty. Queen Joanna of Castile. The queen who slept with her dead husband for years and locked herself in a tower talking to his corpse. If you've ever ugly cried your way through a breakup, ghosted someone, or refused to delete your ex's playlist, buckle up. Because Queen Joanna of Castile took post-romantic devotion to a level so intense, so disturbing, and so entirely medieval, that she earned herself the nickname Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. This was not your average weeping widow. This was a queen who slept beside her husband's rotting corpse, fought monks to keep him unburied, and dragged his coffin across Spain while whispering sweet nothings to the skeleton. Joanna wasn't always the mad. In fact, she started off as one of the smartest, most educated princesses in Europe. Born in 1479, she was the daughter of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. Yes, the Catholic monarchs who united Spain, kicked out the Moors, and sent Christopher Columbus sailing west with questionable directions. These two were political titans, and their daughter was expected to rule with equal ferocity. Joanna could read Latin, play multiple instruments, argue theology with bishops, and was not supposed to fall head over heels for anyone. Unfortunately, her parents married her off to Philip the Handsome. Yes, that was literally his name, and he was a walking, talking disaster wrapped in a jawline. Blonde, blue-eyed, muscular, and deeply manipulative, Philip looked like a Renaissance model and acted like the patron saint of cheating husbands. From the moment Joanna met him, she was obsessed. They married in 1496, and Joanna's brain basically melted from lust. She followed him around like a lovesick teenager, ignoring political duties in favor of bedroom marathons and jealous breakdowns. Philip, of course, cheated constantly. He'd vanish for days, sleep with maids, courtiers, nuns, probably goats, and every time Joanna found out, she exploded. There are records of her slapping mistresses in public, tearing out her own hair, and screaming at her ladies in waiting for breathing too close to Philip. At one point, she stabbed a woman in the face for smiling at him. This wasn't love. This was full-blown medieval codependency. But things got worse when Joanna unexpectedly became heir to the throne of Castile. After the deaths of her older siblings and their children, plague, bad luck, overly medieval lifestyles, Joanna suddenly became Queen of Castile in 1504, which meant Philip was now king consort. And that's when everything exploded. Philip didn't want to be king in name only. He wanted all the power, all the gold, and zero Joanna. He spread rumors that she was insane, refused to let her meet with ministers, and tried to have her declared mentally unfit to rule. This, of course, drove Joanna even crazier. Her mother Isabella died, Castile was in chaos, and Philip began cutting her off from government entirely. But in 1506, karma struck. Philip caught a fever and died. Some say typhoid, others whispered poison. Either way, Joanna snapped. Instead of grieving like a normal queen, wearing black, commissioning a statue, mourning quietly in a candlelit chapel, Joanna refused to bury him. She had his body embalmed, placed in a lead coffin, and ordered that it stay with her, like in the same room, every night, for months. She slept next to it, talked to it, kissed it, and refused to allow any woman near the coffin for fear they might seduce the corpse. Yes, you read that correctly. She jealously guarded the body of a dead man as though he might cheat on her from beyond the grave. And then it got even more unhinged. Joanna decided that Philip needed to be moved to Granada for a proper burial next to his ancestors. So she ordered a royal procession, coffin, guards, priests, and a bunch of very traumatized courtiers, to walk the coffin across Spain on foot. But here's the kicker. They could only travel at night. Why? Because Joanna didn't want women to look upon him in daylight. The journey took months. She'd stop at monasteries and refuse to let the monks bury the body. She once forced a local priest to open the coffin just so she could check on Philip's face, which by that point was very much decomposing. Spain's nobility was horrified. The commoners were terrified. The church whispered demonic possession. Joanna just called it loyalty. Eventually, her father Ferdinand had enough. He declared Joanna legally insane, stripped her of power, and locked her in the royal convent of Tordesillas, where she would remain for 46 years. Yes, 46. From age 30 until her death at 76, she lived in a single room with no political power, minimal sunlight, and a very elaborate chapel built next to her chambers so she could keep visiting Philip's coffin. And oh yes, she kept the body nearby for years. Even when the coffin began to stink, even when priests begged her to let go, Joanna insisted on praying by his side and sometimes speaking to him during dinner. Reports say she refused to bathe, wore a single black dress until it fell apart, and spoke in strange tongues during storms. But here's the twist. Was she really mad? Modern historians argue that Joanna was never clinically insane. Instead, she was gaslit by every man around her, her father, her husband, and later her son, Charles V, all of whom wanted her out of the way to claim the throne. Her madness may have been depression, grief, or pure political manipulation. After all, she never harmed her children, never started wars, and was literate and coherent during most of her captivity. So was Joanna truly insane? Or was she a shattered woman, madly in love with a cheating prince, trapped by patriarchal ambition in a prison disguised as a convent? Maybe she was both, and maybe that's what makes her story so tragic. She died in 1555, still locked away, still alone, still known only as the Mad, but her legacy is unforgettable. She birthed one of the greatest emperors in European history, Charles V, and her tragic life became legend, opera, and Gothic ghost story all in one. In the end, Queen Joanna wasn't just a grieving widow. She was the queen who clung to love even when it decayed in her arms. The ruler who whispered to bones, slept beside shadows, and refused to let the world bury her heartbreak. And that, dear listener, is where we end this medieval circus of power, lust, madness, and royal disasters. Don't forget to blow out your candle, lock your crypt, and hug your loved ones, alive ones only, because in the Middle Ages you never knew who was sleeping next to a corpse.